Story number one. In the quiet of a sleepy neighborhood, Nora's old house stood like a relic, its creaking bones hiding secrets she'd never dared to imagine. She lived alone, her days a rhythm of work and solitude. But lately, the house felt alive in ways it shouldn't. Small things vanished, a snack, a scarf, leaving Nora to doubt her own memory. Then came the noises, soft thumps from above, like footsteps in the dark. She laughed them off as squirrels, but deep down, she knew the house was whispering something sinister. One night, a shadow flickered across the ceiling vent, too human, too deliberate, and Nora's heart froze. She wasn't alone. The air in the house grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Nora's mind raced, replaying every misplaced item, every odd sound. She tried to dismiss the shadow as exhaustion, but her gut screamed otherwise. The old house, with its sagging floors and peeling paint, had always felt like a refuge, until now. Something, or someone, was sharing her space, watching her every move. By the time she set up a camera to catch the truth, Nora was already wondering if she'd ever feel safe in her own home again. So, it started with these little things going missing. Nora's life was simple, a solitary dance in a quiet corner of town. I live alone in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so I figured that I was just forgetful at first. A protein bar vanished from the kitchen counter, a sock disappeared from the laundry, a protein bar here, a sock there, whatever, right? She shrugged it off, blaming her scattered mind. But then my TV would be on different inputs than when I left. The screen would flicker to a news channel or a late-night infomercial when she returned home, though she swore she'd left it on Netflix. Nothing huge, but just enough to make me second-guess myself. The house was old, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of years. The weirdest thing, though, was that I'd hear these faint bumps in the ceiling sometimes. At first, Nora chalked it up to critters. I chalked it up to raccoons or whatever. My house is old. Stuff creaks. But the sounds came at odd hours, too rhythmic for animals, too deliberate for settling wood. She'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, her ears straining to make sense of the soft thuds. They weren't loud, but they were persistent, like a heartbeat in the house's bones. But then, one night, I came home late from work, and I could have sworn that I saw a shadow move past the vent opening in the hallway ceiling. The hallway was dim, lit only by a flickering bulb, but the shadow was unmistakable, a quick human shape gliding across the vent's slats. I told myself that I was just tired imagination, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. Nora's skin prickled, her breath shallow as she stood frozen beneath the vent. She tried to laugh it off, but the house felt different now. Its quiet, no longer comforting, but oppressive, as if it was hiding something. Determined to reclaim her peace, Nora ordered a motion sensor camera online. So, I set up one of those cheap motion sensor cameras that I bought off Amazon, pointed it straight at the attic access panel in the hallway. She positioned it carefully, the lens trained on the trapdoor in the ceiling, its hinges rusted but intact. She told herself it was overkill, that she'd catch a raccoon or nothing at all. But sleep came harder now. Her dreams haunted by the thought of unseen eyes watching her through the walls. The notification came at 2 a.m., sharp and jarring. Pulling Nora from a restless sleep, I got a notification at 2 a.m. Motion detected. Her phone glowed in the dark, her fingers trembling as she opened the app. I opened the clip and instantly my stomach dropped. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A figure descended the attic ladder, moving with eerie precision. There was a person climbing down from the attic, like full-on quietly stepping down the ladder, looking around and heading into my kitchen. Nora's breath caught. She'd been in the house, asleep, when this happened. I was in this house at that time that clip was taken too. Her heart pounded, a drumbeat of fear that drowned out the silence. I instantly froze. She grabbed a baseball bat from under her bed, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. Well, as you can imagine, I called the cops immediately, locked myself in my room with a bat, freaking out while they did the full sweep. The police arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they searched the house. They found no one at first, but when they checked the attic, there was a little setup up there, a sleeping bag, crumpled snack wrappers, a small camping stove, and empty water bottles were tucked into a corner of the attic, a makeshift home hidden above her own. A sleeping bag, some snacks, a small camping stove, empty water bottles. Someone had clearly been living up there. The truth unraveled slowly. The person was my neighbor's grown son who apparently had some drug issues and got kicked out a while back. He'd slipped into the attic during Nora's vacation months earlier, using her absence to carve out a secret space. He broke in when I was on vacation a few months earlier and just, well, never left. He'd crept down at night, pilfering food, flipping through TV channels, living a shadow life in her home. He'd sneak down at night to grab food or watch TV, and he got arrested. The police found him hiding nearby, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. Nora's world shifted that night. I moved out 3 weeks later, and I still have trouble sleeping in total silence because now every creak makes me think that someone's crawling around above me. She packed her life into boxes, leaving the house behind, but its echoes followed her. The new apartment was modern, sterile, but every creak or bump sent her heart racing, her eyes darting to the ceiling. She'd check locks twice, then 3 times. Her trust in solitude shattered. The neighbor's son had left traces beyond the attic, faint scuff marks on the ladder, a forgotten spoon under a couch cushion. Nora learned he'd watched her routines, timing his movements to avoid her. The thought made her skin crawl, the violation deeper than stolen snacks. She wondered how long he'd watched, how close he'd come to her while she slept. The police assured her he was gone, but the attic's shadow lingered in her mind. Years later, Nora heard whispers from new tenants, strange noises, misplaced items, a feeling of being watched. The house stood unchanged, its weathered facade hiding its secrets. Nora never returned, but she carried the weight of that night, a reminder that safety is fragile, and even the quietest places can harbor unseen threats. Story number 2, the wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying whispers of a past that refused to rest. Jack and his father stood before an old barn, its weathered wood the last remnant of a forgotten ranch. The air felt heavy, not with the chill of the northeastern autumn, but with something older, darker, watching from within. Jack's father saw potential, a workspace, a storage haven, but Jack felt only unease. This barn wasn't empty. It held something that didn't want them there. They stepped inside, the door groaning under its own weight. The interior was pristine, a stark contrast to the desolate land outside. Gravel crunched underfoot, laid to keep the dust at bay, and sturdy beams stood like sentinels down the center. But the silence was wrong, too thick, as if the barn was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a mistake. Jack's father, practical as ever, pulled out a disposable camera, its clicks echoing in the stillness. He was determined to capture every angle, to show Jack's mother the promise of this place. The beams loomed overhead, their shadows sharp against the clean walls. Jack wandered, his footsteps muffled, his skin prickling with the sense of being watched. The barn's cleanliness felt like a mask, hiding something raw, something violent just beneath the surface. He shook it off, blaming the isolation. But the air seemed to hum, a low pulse that grew stronger with each photo his father snapped. What had happened here? And why did it feel like the barn remembered? They left with a roll of film, unaware of the secret it would reveal. A week later, the family gathered around the kitchen table. The photos spread out like a puzzle. Most showed the barn as they'd seen it, tidy, solid, ready for a new life. But one image stopped them cold. It was of the interior, taken from the inside the front door a few paces in, I would guess. The barn was a wreck, hay spilling from the loft, dirt floor bare, no trace of gravel. And in this particular photo, the barn was a complete mess, nothing like it had been when we were there. The photo held something worse. On the first beam, a silhouette stood, human, but headless. Its form etched in shadow. Footprints trailed across the dirt, leading to the beam, but none led away. The thing that stood out to our family about this photo of the interior of this barn was on the first center stanchion. There was a silhouette of a man, but with no head and footprints on the dirt floor leading in, but not out of the barn. Jack's mother gasped. His siblings froze. When we pulled this photo out from the stack, we were kind of confused and thought that maybe we had gotten somebody else's photo in our group of photos, but it was clearly the same barn. The family debated, had Walmart mixed up the photos? But the barn's distinctive beams, the shape of the door, matched perfectly. This wasn't a mistake. It was a glimpse into something else. A moment frozen in talks. Jack's father, usually skeptical, grew quiet, his fingers tracing the footprints in the photo. The barn had shown them something it wanted them to see. But why? They decided to return, to confront the owner and unravel the mystery. Months later, in the crisp fall air, Jack and his father drove back to northeastern Montana, the photo tucked in an envelope. Dad and I went back up to northeastern Montana later that year in the fall to do some hunting. The owner, a weathered man with deep-set eyes, met them outside the barn. They showed him the normal photos first, then the strange one. So, we went and spoke to the guy who owned this barn, showed him our photos, and then the weird photo as well. His face drained of color, his hands trembling as he held the image. When we showed him that photo, his face immediately went pale white, and the look in his eyes was one that I'd never seen in another person. He spoke in a whisper, his voice breaking. He told us that his grandpa had been murdered when he was a small kid. But his parents never told him about what happened, and the murder was never solved. The barn was the scene of that crime, a wound never healed, its details lost to time. The silhouette, the footprints, they were echoes of that violence, captured as if the barn itself was confessing. Jack's father set the photos down, his decision made. Needless to say, Dad never bought the barn and the owner. He had it torn down the next year. The drive home was silent, the photo burning in Jack's mind. The barn was gone, razed to the ground, but its shadow lingered. And it is definitely one of the spookiest things that I have ever been a part of in my life. Jack wondered what else the barn had seen, what other secrets it had held before it was destroyed. The photo remained, a haunting reminder that some places keep their tragedies close, revealing them only to those who dare to look. Story number 3. The bedroom was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the beds. But something else filled the room. A presence that didn't belong, heavy and cold as a winter grave. They stood in silence, tall and robed, their faceless hoods swallowing the light, watching a boy who couldn't escape. The door wouldn't open, as if the night itself held it shut. And when the screams began, they echoed with a terror that lingered for years. At Steen, Lucas lived alone with his dad in a quiet house on the edge of town. Years later, they sat in their freestanding garage, swapping stories over cigarettes. His dad shared one Lucas didn't recall, thinking it was about someone else, with no memory of it at the time. His dad said he was watching TV when he heard screaming, like top-of-your-lungs panic. He leapt from the couch, racing to Lucas's bedroom. Lucas interrupted, shocked, saying, "Wait, I was screaming." His dad confirmed it was 3 years prior, not when Lucas was a child. Lucas found it freaky, with no clue what his dad meant. He asked what happened, and his dad continued. He ran down the hall, fearing something terrible. The strangest part was the doorknob wouldn't turn, like someone held it from the other side. Lucas's heart sank. The memory flickered, clawing its way back. After 10 seconds, his dad forced the door open, flipped on the light, and saw Lucas standing on his bed, pressed into the corner, screaming, face twisted in horror. After a moment, Lucas calmed, realizing it was just them. He'd told his dad things were in his room. The memory flooded back, and Lucas's eyes watered. He'd been sleeping, then woke to tall figures around his bed, at least 6 feet tall, in black robes with hooded faces, just darkness inside, no distinct faces, shoulder to shoulder around his bed. His bed was in the room's corner, so they lined 2 sides. He stood, backed into the corner, and saw more behind them, guessing 20 figures in a 10 by 12-foot room, filling it completely. He screamed for his dad, feeling like forever before the door opened. They didn't touch him, but radiated a terrible vibe. It was like drowning in dread. Each figure a void that pulled at his soul. Good. The doorknob was standard, cylindrical, with no lock or fault, never a problem before or since. Yet, that night, something stopped his dad from turning it for 10 seconds. That detail gnawed at Lucas, a puzzle with no solution. When the light came on, the figures were gone, leaving only the echo of his screams. His dad, shaken, didn't press for details that night, just stayed until Lucas slept. But Lucas didn't sleep. Not really. His eyes scanned the dark, waiting for them to return. Years later, in the garage, the story unlocked the memory, vivid and raw. Why had he forgotten? Was it fear or something else, sealing it away? Lucas pressed his dad for more, but he only recalled the screams, and the stubborn door. The figures, though, were Lucas's alone, burned into his mind like a photograph. Desperate for answers, Lucas visited the town's historical society. An old archivist, her glasses perched on her nose, listened quietly. She spoke of watchers, entities from local lore said to appear in moments of vulnerability, grief, fear, or change. They didn't harm, but their presence was a warning, a signal of something unseen. Lucas, at 16, had been struggling, school stress, his mom's absence, a future he couldn't grasp. Had they come for that? The archivist showed him a journal from the 1800s describing a farmer who saw robed figures in his barn, faceless, silent, gone by dawn. They come to those who need to face something, she said, her voice low. Lucas left with more questions, the journal's words echoing in his head. He spoke to a neighbor, a retired teacher who'd lived in the house decades ago. She nodded, unsurprised, and said the house had moments where the air turned heavy. She'd never seen figures, but once heard footsteps when alone. Some places hold things we don't understand, she said, offering no comfort. Lucas searched online, finding scattered stories of hooded entities, always in small rooms, always at night. None explained the door, the resistance that felt alive. He kept a light on when sleeping now, checking the knob each night. Some evenings, he feels the air shift, as if the figures are waiting just out of sight, ready to return. Story number 4. Midnight clung to the mountains like a shroud, the air thick with secrets only the peaks could whisper. A lone man trudged up a steep, unlit path, his breath fogging in the sudden chill. Something was wrong. The night had grown too quiet, the stars too dim, as if the world held its breath. Then a faint chime, a cycle bell, cut through the silence, echoing from nowhere. He froze, heart pounding, and turned to look. Nothing but darkness stared back, yet he felt it, a presence watching, waiting. The path twisted higher, swallowed by shadows that seemed to move. The man, Arjun, quickened his pace, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The bell rang again. Closer now, insistent. He spun around, expecting to see a cyclist, a traveler, anyone. But the road was empty. The silence deeper than before. When he turned back, a figure stood beside him, impossibly close. Its face was familiar, like a half-remembered dream, but its eyes were wrong, too dark, too stick. Arjun's skin prickled as the stranger matched his stride. The air grew colder, heavy, with an unnatural weight. Someone who looked familiar, but he just couldn't place who it was. The figure's voice, low and rasping, seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the mountain. Even the voice sounded like someone that he knew, but he just couldn't figure it out. It spoke in fragments, words slurring into one another, as if struggling to mimic human speech. Arjun's gut screamed to run, but his legs felt tethered to the path. The stranger's presence was a pressure, a shadow that clung too tightly. He kept asking for a cigarette again and again. Arjun, a smoker, always carried a pack, but for some reason, he just didn't want to give him one. The request felt like a trap, a test he couldn't afford to fail. The bell chimed once more, sharp and mocking, and Arjun's heart leapt. He glanced back, seeing only the empty road. But when he turned forward, the stranger's hand was on his shoulder, cold, heavy. Wrong. That touch was no human hand. It felt heavy, and he didn't say anything at first. The weight pressed into Arjun's bones as if the mountain itself had claimed him. He stumbled forward, the path blurring, his mind racing with stories he'd heard, tales of spirits that wore familiar faces to deceive. The stranger's breath was close now, a faint hiss that carried no warmth. Arjun knew he had to reach the temple, the sacred ground where no evil could follow. But the path seemed longer, the night darker, and the bell never stopped. 22 years ago, in a bustling hill station nestled in India's northern mountains, Arjun ran a small shop selling trinkets to tourists. He lived near a well-known holiday spot, his house further up along a steep road in the hills. Each evening, he rode his scooter home, navigating the winding, unlit paths with ease. One night around 12:30 a.m., his tire punctured, so he decided to walk the rest of the way. The road was familiar, its curves etched into his memory, but that night it felt different, hostile, alive with unseen eyes. The temperature plummeted as Arjun climbed, the air sharp against his skin. Everything went quiet, and he got this weird sense like something was off. He shrugged it off, blaming fatigue, but the silence grew oppressive, swallowing the usual night sounds of crickets and wind. A few minutes later, he heard a soft cycle bell ringing behind him. He stopped, peering into the darkness. He turned around to check, and no one's there. Nothing. In fact, but when he faced forward, there was this man, walking beside him. The stranger's presence unnerved Arjun. They kept walking together, the guy acting strange, speaking in a low tone, gulping his words. His requests for a cigarette were relentless, almost mechanical. Arjun's instincts screamed danger, but the familiarity of the man's face, a neighbor, a friend, kept him from bolting. Then the guy put his hand on his shoulder, like close friends, but it felt heavy. The touch was icy, sinking into Arjun's flesh like a stone. He wanted to shrug it off, but fear rooted him to the spot. As they neared Arjun's house, the cycle bell rang again, sharp and sudden. He turned quickly, but again nothing behind, heart racing. He looked forward, and the stranger was gone. Even though the man had disappeared, he could still feel that heavy pressure on his shoulder, like someone's hand was still there. Panic seized him. Arjun sprinted the final stretch, the path blurring beneath his feet. His mother, waiting at home, said he looked pale and was sweating like crazy. He collapsed into bed, silent, the weight on his shoulder pulsing like a living thing. Morning brought no relief. The next morning, he went to take a hot shower, but the second that the water touched his back, he yelled. His shoulder burned as if branded. In the mirror, he saw claw marks and scratches all over that shoulder, like something had dug into his skin. The wounds were raw, jagged, unlike any animal's mark. Arjun's mother called a local healer who spoke of spirits that mimicked loved ones to lure victims. Locals believed spirits used familiar faces or voices, asking for vices like cigarettes. Giving in, they said, invited harm, possession, or worse. The healer pointed to the spot where the stranger vanished, just a few steps from a small temple protected by a strong goddess. The temple's presence, she explained, likely broke the spirit's hold. Arjun's wounds healed slowly, but even now, years later, he still has those faint scratch marks on his shoulder. He never walked that path alone again, and the cycle bell's chime haunted his dreams. The mountains, he realized, held more than beauty. They guarded secrets that could claw their way into the living world. Story number 5. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like it was holding its breath. Sam, a 9-year-old college student, sat in his room, the glow of his computer screen the only light in the dark. He got home super late, and I was still awake just gaming. His father had stumbled in, exhausted from another late shift, and their argument had erupted fast. Sharp words about late nights and responsibility. Why are you still up? You've got class tomorrow. The fight was nothing new, just a flare of tempers, but it left Sam simmering, his fingers smashing the keyboard harder than necessary. Something felt different tonight, though a weight in the air, like the house itself was watching. He tried to shake it off, diving back into his game, but the silence grew heavier, pressing against his chest. The layout of our house was simple: living room in the middle, my room to the left, my parents' room to the right. And if either of us stood at our door, we could see the other across the hall. Sam glanced toward the hall, half expecting to see his father's shadow, but it was empty. Then it came, a faint creak from his parents' room, like the bed shifting under an unseen weight. His pulse quickened. He turned up the game's volume, trying to drown out the unease, but the sound lingered in his mind, a warning he couldn't ignore. The house seemed to stir around 3:30 a.m., though. I heard the bed in my parents' room creak, then heavy footsteps coming toward my room. The steps were slow, deliberate, not like his father's tired shuffle. They echoed in the hall, each one louder, closer, until they stopped right beside his bed. I panicked a bit. I quickly got under my blanket, pretending to be asleep. Sam held his breath, his heart hammering. The air grew thick, and a slow, heavy breathing filled the room so close he could feel its warmth. I held my breath a little bit, but I could hear it, slow, heavy breathing right next to me. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching him through the blanket. Minutes stretched into eternity. It didn't leave for 15, maybe 20 minutes, and I just sort of laid there, frozen. Sam's mind raced. His father? An intruder? But the breathing was wrong, too steady, too deep. He pictured his grandfather, a man he'd never met, a figure from his father's stories, stern and unyielding. He just smiled to himself, though, and said, "Must have been my dad then." His father had spoken of him often, a man lost too young, whose presence seemed to linger in quiet moments. He genuinely believed it was his dad looking out for him as well from the afterlife, helping him during those stressful days. But this felt different, not comforting, menacing. The footsteps retreated, silent now, leaving only the weight of their presence. Sam didn't sleep. I must have dozed off after that, still wrapped up in fear. When morning came, he woke to a sting on his shoulder. I checked, and there was this cut, a clean 2-inch long cut across my shoulder. No blood, no explanation, just a sharp, precise line, no sharp objects nearby. My nails were trimmed, and really just no explanation. He stumbled to the kitchen where his father sat, sipping coffee. When I told my dad, he didn't seem surprised. He just calmly said, "That's my dad warning you, telling you not to give me a hard time." Sam's blood ran cold. Was it a warning or something more? Well, I completely freaked. The house had always been a place of comfort, but now it felt alive, watchful. Sam said the father had mentioned strange things before, a feeling of a presence, a pressure on his legs or bed, shifting gently like somebody was there. He'd attributed it to his own father, a guardian from beyond, easing his stress from long hours at the banquet hall. He lost his father when he was really young, and he loved him deeply. But Sam wasn't so sure. The presence wasn't kind. It was heavy, judgmental, like a hand pressing down on the house, demanding obedience after the cut. Sam began to notice more, shadows flickering in corners, a faint hum in the walls at night, the sense of eyes on him when he was alone. He tried to talk to his mother, but she dismissed it, exhausted from her own work. "Your father's just tired," she said, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Sam began to avoid his room, sleeping on the couch, the TV on to drown out the silence. The arguments with his father grew sharper, each one leaving a residue of guilt. One night, he woke to the sound of footsteps again, circling the living room, never stopping. He didn't dare look, didn't dare move. The next morning, another cut appeared, this time on his forearm, thin and precise, like a signature. He didn't tell his father this time, afraid of what he'd say. Sam started researching, digging into family history. His grandfather, Thomas, had been a strict man, a disciplinarian, who'd raised his father with an iron hand. Stories painted him as loving but unforgiving, quick to correct any defiance. Had Thomas's spirit lingered, bound to the family, enforcing his will? Sam found an old photo in the attic. His grandfather staring sternly from a faded frame, his eyes seeming to follow Sam's every move. That night, the photo was on his desk when he returned home, though he'd left it in the attic. His father saw it and paled. "He's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. Other weird stuff started happening after that, too. Shadows, sounds, that same heavy breathing feeling, and it just got too much. The house became unbearable. Objects moved, keys in the wrong drawer, chairs shifted slightly out of place. Sam's father grew quieter, his belief in his father's protective presence wavering. One night, Sam saw him, a shadow at the end of the hall, taller than any man, its edges blurred, but its presence solid. It didn't move, just watched, and Sam felt a wave of guilt, as if he'd failed some unspoken test. And so, we eventually decided to move out. They packed quickly, leaving most of their belongings behind, fleeing to a small apartment across town. But the presence followed, subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of Sam's eye, a faint pressure on his bed at night. Months later, tragedy struck. My dad passed away. Sam's father collapsed one evening, his heart given out under the weight of years of stress. And all I can hope is that he finally met his dad again, that they're together now, wherever they are, and that his soul is finally at peace. But Sam wasn't so sure. At the funeral, he felt it again, the heavy breathing, the unseen eyes. Closer now. He moved again to a new city, hoping to escape. But the cuts kept appearing, always at night, always unexplained, each one a reminder of a debt unpaid. He began to wonder if it was his grandfather at all, or something else, something that had latched onto their family, feeding on their guilt, their grief, Sam sought out a priest, a man who'd seen things others dismissed. The priest listened, his face grim. Some spirits don't protect, they punish, he said. They cling to what they know, control, order, and they don't let go. He suggested a blessing, a ritual to sever the tie, but warned it might not be enough. Sam performed it alone, scattering salt, burning sage, speaking words he barely believed. The cut stopped for a while, but the presence lingered, a shadow in his dreams. One night, he woke to find a new cut, this time on his chest, forming a single word, obey. Sam knew then he'd never be free. The weight of absence was his now, a legacy he couldn't escape. Story number 6. The gas station's neon lights buzzed softly, casting a pale glow over the cracked pavement. For 11-year-old Ethan, it was a familiar stop, just a short walk from home, a place he'd visited countless times for snacks or sodas. But tonight, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like a storm was brewing, though the sky was clear. His mother's angry text still burned in his mind, her words sharp and nonsensical, ending with a curt order to buy his own dinner with $70 in his pocket. Ethan set out, unaware that this routine trip would become a memory he'd never shake. He pushed open the glass door, the bell jingling above him. The store was quiet, save for the hum of the coolers and the clerk's board tapping at the register. Ethan's sneakers squeaked on the linoleum as he headed for the snack aisle, his mind on pizza and maybe a soda. But as he rounded the corner, he caught sight of a man in the walk-in fridge, surrounded by rows of beer. Tall, broad-shouldered, he stood motionless, his presence filling the space like a shadow that didn't belong. Ethan grabbed a bag of chips, trying to focus, but he felt eyes on him. Glancing up, he saw the man watching, his gaze steady and unblinking. Ethan's stomach tightened, but he told himself it was nothing, just a guy making sure a kid wasn't up to trouble. He moved to the next aisle, picking out a candy bar, but the feeling didn't fade. The man's stare followed him, cold and deliberate, like a predator sizing up prey. At the counter, Ethan handed over his items, his heart beating a little faster. The clerk bagged his snacks and slid the pizza box across, oblivious to the tension. Then Ethan felt it, a presence at his side, too close. He looked up, and there was the man towering over him, his dark eyes glinting under the fluorescent lights. Fear clawed at Ethan's chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't just a guy in a store. Something about him was wrong, deeply wrong. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Ethan mumbled a shaky response, his hands clutching the pizza box. He wanted to run, to bolt for the door, but his legs felt heavy, pinned by the weight of that gaze. The man leaned closer, his questions coming fast, too fast. Ethan's answers were short, his voice trembling as he tried to edge toward the exit, praying the clerk would notice. But the clerk didn't look up, and the man didn't stop. By the time that I'd gotten home, I changed my clothes, went outside, and walked to a gas station, which was only about maybe a quarter of a mile away from me. Ethan had made this walk dozens of times, alone or with his brother, always careful, always alert. I've always walked to this gas station either by myself, with my older brother, or with another guardian. So, honestly, I thought that it would be no big deal to go by myself because I was always so hyper vigilant about my surroundings anyway. But tonight, his vigilance wasn't enough. Anyway, as I got to the store, I saw this man inside the walk-in fridge where there was just a ton of beer. Ethan hadn't thought much of it at first, but the man's stare had lingered, tracking him through the aisles. And as I was walking around the store to get some snacks, I noticed him staring at me a couple of times. He'd tried to ignore it, but now, at the counter, there was no escaping. As I was paying off for the stuff at the counter, after being there for about 30 minutes, the same man is standing next to me. And it was at this point that I got scared. The man's questions grew stranger, more invasive. He started asking me questions like, "How old are you?" I replied back with my age, stating that I was 11. Ethan's voice shook as he answered, hoping honesty would make the man back off. But it didn't. And he proceeded to look me up and down where he asked, "Are you by any chance healthy?" The question sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He mumbled something vague, his mind racing with every warning he'd ever heard about strangers. Outside, the man followed, his steps deliberate, matching Ethan's hurried pace. I try walking home around the other way around, but he keeps stopping me in my tracks. Ethan's heart pounded as he dodged, taking side paths, anything to shake him. The man's voice grew sharper, his questions more unhinged. He started asking me more alarming questions like, "Did you know that you can live without a kidney?" Ethan played dumb, forcing a laugh, saying, "No, that's nice." But his fear was a living thing, clawing at his chest. The man offered a ride, his tone insistent, almost angry. Actually, it got to the point where he started asking if he could give me a ride home, and I declined his offer more than 20 times until finally he gave up, left me alone, all agitated, and I walked home. Ethan ran the last stretch, the pizza box bouncing in his arms, his breath ragged. He locked the door behind him, his hands shaking. The man's dark eyes burned into his memory. Months later, Ethan's fear found new life. At a crowded mall, he spotted the man again, standing near a store entrance, watching the crowd. It wasn't until the following next year that I saw him again at the mall. And man, I was terrified. Ethan froze, his pulse hammering, and he tugged his brother's arm, begging to leave. I refused to go to that mall because I don't ever want to bump into that guy ever again. The man hadn't seen him, but the sight was enough to bring it all back. The questions, the stare, the feeling of being hunted. Ethan never told his mother the full story, afraid she'd blame him or dismiss it. But the memory clung to him, a shadow that darkened even the brightest days. Even though this was almost 10 years ago now, I've never been able to get this out of my head. He'd walked to that gas station countless times since, but never alone, and never without scanning the aisles for that face. The man was human, or so Ethan hoped, but the terror he'd felt was something else entirely, something that made the world feel less safe, less certain. The gas station still stood, its neon lights buzzing as always, a beacon for late-night travelers and kids with a few bucks to spend. But for Ethan, it was a place where innocence had cracked, where a stranger's questions had revealed a darkness he hadn't known existed. He carried that night with him, a reminder to always look over his shoulder, to always be ready for the next shadow in the crowd. Story number 7. The apartment was a small world, its thin walls barely holding back the noise of the hallway beyond. Ellie, barely 12, lived there with her mother, Sarah, in a place that felt safe until it didn't. Across the hall lived a man whose presence was a shadow, his door always closed but his gaze ever present. His words, sharp and strange, had haunted the building for years. But tonight, something shifted. A line was crossed. Ellie heard the front door slam, her mother's footsteps heavy with fear, and knew the neighbor had done something unthinkable. The hallway was narrow, a dim strip of flickering lights and peeling paint, but it was the man's door that drew attention, always shut tight, as if hiding secrets. Ellie had seen him, tall, gaunt, with eyes that lingered too long, and his voice carried a weight that made her skin crawl. He'd mutter to himself, words she couldn't catch, and his laughter was a jagged thing, echoing late at night. Sarah had tried to bridge the gap, to ease the tension that hung between their families, but the man's disdain was a wall no kindness could breach. Ellie sat on the couch, her schoolwork forgotten. As the air grew thick with unease, she'd always felt watched in the apartment, but now the feeling was sharper, like a blade pressed against her thoughts. The neighbors' actions were unpredictable. Notes slipped under doors, strange knocks at odd hours, but this was different. Sarah's face, pale and trembling, told a story of something darker, something that couldn't be ignored. Ellie's heart raced as she waited for her mother to speak, to explain the fear that had followed her inside. The building was old, its creaks and groans a constant companion, but they offered no comfort now. Ellie's mind spun with stories she'd heard, tenants who'd left in haste, whispers of the man's past, crimes no one could prove. She'd laughed them off once, but the man's presence was a stain, spreading through the walls into her dreams. Sarah had locked the door, checked it twice, but the lock felt flimsy against the threat that lived just across the hall, waiting, always waiting. Ellie's question hung in the air, soft but urgent. What had happened? Sarah's voice broke as she answered, her words a confession of terror. The neighbor had spoken something so vile, so unprompted, that it shattered her resolve. Ellie's world, once small and safe, cracked open, and the man's shadow filled the gap. She said that our neighbor said this completely unprompted. He said, "You know, if I were you, I'd keep your daughter away from guys like me." The words were a blade, cutting through the fragile peace of their home. The apartment building was a maze of cramped units, each door a barrier against the world outside. Right across from our apartment was a very creepy neighbor. The man's reputation was a patchwork of rumors, wild stories of his rants, his sudden rages, his eyes that seemed to see too much. I could write whole books about all the creepy, wild, and downright insane things that he said and did throughout the 2 years that he was our neighbor. Sarah had hoped to mend things, to find some humanity in him. My mom and this neighbor were having a casual conversation with each other, with my mom's goal being to try to find some common ground with him. But the conversation had soured, turning into something sinister. But evidently, something went wrong during this conversation as my mom suddenly came stomping into our apartment, loudly shutting and locking the door. Sarah's fear was a living thing, her hands shaking as she faced Ellie. She was visibly upset and shaken, so I asked what was wrong, her voice trembling. The man's words weren't just cruel. They were a promise, a threat wrapped in a smile. Now, While I will never know exactly what he meant by this, my mind definitely had plenty of ideas of what he actually meant. Ellie's days changed after that, and the worst part was that I was often home alone. As I did online school while my mom went to work, the apartment, once a refuge, became a cage. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor felt like his approach. So from then on, I never felt safe when I was home alone, as my imagination ran wild on what he might end up doing to me. Sarah's warning was clear. Keep the door locked. Stay away from him. My mom only told me about this because she wanted to warn me to stay the heck away from this guy and to never do anything like keep the door unlocked or anything like that. The man's presence lingered, a specter in Ellie's thoughts. She avoided the hallway, kept the curtains drawn, but his door was always there, a reminder of the threat across the hall. Months passed, and the fear became a part of her, a weight she carried alone. Then news came. He was gone, dead. His apartment empty now. I never thought that I would say this kind of thing, and I feel kind of guilty about it. But thankfully, he ended up dying before he ever did follow through on his creepy comment. Relief battled guilt in Ellie's heart, but the apartment never felt the same. Years later, Ellie stood in a new home, far from that building, but the neighbors' words echoed still. And I can tell you that she didn't have to tell me twice. The threat had shaped her, taught her to listen to the quiet warnings of the world. The man was gone, but his shadow remained, a lesson in the dangers that hide behind familiar doors. Story number 8. The monsoon rain battered the old estate house, its walls groaning under the weight of a century's secrets. 7-year-old Arjun lay on his mother's bed, flipping through a car magazine, the only light coming from a flickering candle. The rubber trees outside swayed violently, their shadows dancing across the room like ghostly fingers. A sudden crack of thunder shook the house, and the power died, plunging everything into darkness. Arjun's sister, Lila, clutched her doll, her eyes gleamed as their mother fumbled for the emergency flashlight. Something felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. Arjun's family had moved here out of necessity, the isolated house surrounded by a gloomy plantation, their only affordable refuge. But tonight, as the storm raged, the house seemed alive, watching them with unseen eyes. The candle's weak glow cast eerie shapes on the walls, making the familiar room feel foreign. Arjun's mother lit more candles, her face tense but calm, urging the children to stay close. He grew restless, his mind on the stack of magazines in his room. He decided to grab one of his car magazines from his room, his small feet padding across the creaky floorboards. He didn't bother taking a candle or a flashlight, as the moonlight coming through the trees gave just enough visibility. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows, the wind howling outside like a chorus of wails. Arjun's heart thudded, a primal instinct warning him to turn back. But he pressed on, determined. He reached his room, the air colder here, heavy, with the scent of damp wood and something metallic. Arjun snatched his magazine from the desk, but a strange pull made him glance at the window. There, just beyond the glass, were two glowing red eyes, like molten marbles, staring directly at him. They looked like shiny glass marbles, deep red, unmoving, and just staring, only a few feet away from the window. His body locked, breath trapped in his chest, as if the eyes had seized his soul. Suddenly they rushed toward the window fast, like inhumanely fast. The glass rattled, and Arjun screamed, bolting back to his mother's room, his voice choked with terror. Arjun stumbled into the candlelit bedroom, tears streaming down his face. He tried to tell his mother and sister what he saw, but they didn't believe him, saying he must have seen an animal or was just imagining things. His mother pulled him close, her voice soothing but dismissive, while Lila giggled, calling him a scaredy cat. The dismissal stung, but the memory of those eyes burned brighter, refusing to fade. Arjun buried the incident deep, convincing himself it was a trick of the storm, a child's overactive mind. But the house never felt the same. Every creak, every shadow held a threat, as if those eyes were still watching, waiting. Years passed, and Arjun grew up, leaving the plantation house behind. But the memory lingered like a scar. Now, Arjun visited his father in their ancestral home, a sprawling, century-old mansion that creaked with history. The air was thick with nostalgia, but also an unease that clung to the walls. His aunt joined them for a barbecue, the evening filled with laughter and beer until the conversation turned to the past. Arjun hesitated, then admitted the old house always unnerved him. His dad brushed it off, saying, "Come on, it's just old," but then mentioned seeing a black figure with glowing red eyes when he was around 7. Arjun's heart stopped. The description matched his own encounter perfectly, down to the rush toward the window. He almost had a panic attack when he heard this, as it was exactly what happened to him, and he never told his dad about it. The fire crackled, casting long shadows as Arjun shared his story. The room grew still, the weight of their shared secret pressing down. His aunt sat there for a second, then said, "Wait, Dad told me he saw something like that when he was a kid, too." Their grandfather, decades ago, had seen the same crimson eyes, the same fleeting figure at the same age. None of them had spoken of it until now, as if the entity demanded silence. They sat there in silence, all three agreeing to chalk it up to their imagination. But their eyes betrayed fear, knowing it was real. What was this thing haunting their family across generations, never harming, but always watching? Arjun couldn't sleep that night. He lay in the guest room, the mansion's walls whispering memories of his childhood terror. He researched local legends, finding tales of a guardian spirit tied to the land, its red eyes a warning or a test. But why their family? Why always at 7? He installed motion sensors in the old house, but they triggered randomly, capturing nothing. The dogs whimpered at night, staring at empty corners. Arjun's aunt began carrying a protective amulet, while his father avoided the topic, his bravado gone. Whatever it was, it wanted to be seen, to be remembered, and Arjun feared it wasn't done with them yet. Story number 9. The forest was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for a sound that never came. Jack and his wife, Emily, hiked along a narrow trail in the nature preserve, their dog, Rusty, trotting beside them. The trees loomed tall, their branches knitting a canopy that blocked out the sun. Every step felt watched. Though Jack couldn't say why, the air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. They'd been on this trail before, a winding path through dense woods, but today it felt different. Rusty's ears twitched, his nose low to the ground, as if he sensed something Jack and Emily couldn't. The couple exchanged a glance, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. They were alone, or so they thought, but the forest had eyes, and they were closing in. A rustle broke the silence, faint but deliberate, from the underbrush. Jack's hand tightened on Rusty's leash. He scanned the trail ahead, a bottleneck with a path squeezed between two rocky outcrops. No one was there, not a soul in sight. But then, from nowhere, figures emerged. A group of people, their clothes worn, their smiles too wide. They moved as one, like a pack. And Jack's gut twisted. Where had they come from? The group stopped, their eyes locking onto Jack, Emily, and Rusty. "Nice dog," one said, a man with a voice too smooth, too practiced. The others nodded, their gazes unblinking, their postures stiff. Emily stepped closer to Jack, her hand brushing his. The group's questions came fast, about Rusty, the trail, the day. But their tone wasn't curious. It was hungry. Jack's skin prickled. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. They answered politely, trying to move on. But the group pressed closer, their words relentless, their smiles never reaching their eyes. Rusty growled low, his tail stiff, his body angled toward the strangers. Jack's heart pounded. He didn't know these people, but he knew predators when he saw them. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching, waiting for what came next. Jack and Emily were out for a hike in the nature preserve, Rusty padding along happily. They came across some people walking, almost like a family, but they seemed a bit off. The group was friendly enough on the surface. They asked what kind of dog Rusty was and how old he was. Jack and Emily answered politely, but the conversation felt forced. They tried to go their own way, but the group tried to keep the conversation going. Jack kept his tone light, but his instincts screamed to leave. Finally, they broke away, continuing down the trail. A few minutes later, Emily stopped, her voice low. She said, "Where did they come from?" Jack hadn't heard anyone approaching, and the trail's bottleneck meant they should have seen the group from a distance. Emily said, "Do you feel weird? Like someone's watching us, or like we're being looked at strangely?" Jack didn't answer at first, but he felt it too, a weight on his back, like eyes boring into him. Emily stopped, looked at him, and said, "I felt the same thing." Rusty's behaviors sealed it. He was walking very slowly with his head down, almost as if he sensed a predator, but didn't know where it was coming from. Jack, a big man who didn't scare easily, felt his pulse quicken. They picked up their pace, the trail stretching endlessly before them. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of their boots and Rusty's soft whines. They reached their car without incident, but the unease lingered. Later, they learned the truth about those woods. There had been several cases of people living in those woods, showing up randomly on the side of the roads in the middle of the night, trying to stop cars. The forest beyond the trails was a maze of thorns and cliffs, impassable without skill. Jack and Emily realized they'd been watched, tested, maybe even hunted. Back home, the experience gnawed at Jack. He couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. Too many, too focused. Emily noticed Rusty's behavior change. He'd freeze at the edge of their yard, staring into the distance, as if expecting those strangers to emerge. Jack started researching the preserve, digging into old forums and local news. What he found chilled him. Hikers had reported that similar encounters, groups appearing from nowhere, asking questions, then vanishing. Some claimed the families weren't families at all, but something else, something that lived in the woods and wore human faces. One night, Jack woke to Rusty growling at the window. He peered outside, seeing nothing but darkness. But the air felt wrong, like it had on the trail. He checked the locks, his heart racing, and found a small symbol scratched into their mailbox, a circle with 3 lines, like the one he'd later learn was found near the preserve. It wasn't there the day before. Jack and Emily never returned to the preserve. They sold their hiking gear, sticking to city parks from then on, but the forest stayed with them. Jack would catch Emily staring out the windows, her face pale, as if she felt those eyes again. Rusty never relaxed, always watching the shadows. Months later, a news report mentioned a missing hiker in the preserve. Search teams found only a backpack, torn, with that same circle symbol scratched into a nearby tree. Jack turned off the TV, his hands shaking. He didn't need to hear more. The watchers were still out there, waiting. They'd escaped once, but Jack knew the truth. Some predators don't chase. They watch, they wait, and they remember. The forest had let them go, but it hadn't forgotten. And deep in those woods, something still walks the trails, wearing faces that don't belong, watching for the next to wander too far. Story number 10. The basement smelled of damp earth and something older, something that didn't belong. Anna, barely 12, stood at the foot of the stairs, her flashlight flickering. The air was too heavy, pressing against her skin like an invisible hand. The house was new to her family, but it felt ancient, its walls whispering secrets. The basement door had strange locks, childproof, but on the outside, as if meant to keep something in. Anna's stomach twisted. She wasn't alone. A sound came from the back bedroom, a low hum, not quite human. It wasn't the water heater or the pipes. It was deliberate, like a voice trapped in the concrete, calling her name. She stepped forward, the carpet soft but wrong, clinging to her shoes. The mirrors on the closet doors reflected nothing, not her, not the room, just darkness. The basement wasn't just empty, it was waiting. Then the hum stopped, and the mirrors shivered, their surfaces rippling like water. Something was behind them, something that knew Anna was there, and it wanted her to stay. I remember when my family freshly moved to our house about 12 to 13 years ago. The old farmhouse sat on a sprawling property, its paint peeling, its fields wild. The family, Anna, her 3 siblings, and their parents, had toured it before moving in. We had just looked in the daylight basement, which was carpeted. It had a bedroom, a bathroom, a storage closet, and another connected closet that held the water heater. The basement felt off, its air stale, its corners too dark. The bedroom had a closet which had 3 huge mirrors as doors. A small door inside led to the water heater closet, a cramped, musty In the closet was a small door that connected to the water heater closet on their way out. Anna's older sister, Claire, locked her in the basement, laughing. Anyway, on our way back upstairs from touring, in the basement, my sister locked me in there, which had child lock hinges on the top and the bottom of the staircase door. The locks were odd, external, like a bar. They were on the outside, like they were either trying to keep a child from going down there, which made no sense for the bottom child locking, but made the most sense for them, or like they were trying to keep something or someone downstairs. Anna felt a chill, a sense of being watched. Either although I got the most eerie vibe from this basement, like I wasn't alone in this completely empty space. Life in the house began strangely. Well, eventually, when we first moved in, my siblings and I kept finding bones just all over the property. They weren't just scattered, they were paired with golf balls, an unsettling pattern. The weird part about this was that whenever we found a bone, there was always a golf ball nearby. One bone, found on a fence, had carvings in an unknown script. I remember finding one with carvings in it too, in another language hanging on one of our fences. Their father dismissed them as animal remains. My dad wrote them off as animal bones any time that we found one, and eventually threw them all away. Plastic bags of clothes, women's dresses, men's boxers appeared in the fields. We found clothes in plastic bags around the property, too, that were mainly female clothes or male boxes, and those were thrown away, too. 2 nooses hung in a tree, later repurposed for cattle before the tree was cut down. There were a couple of nooses hanging loosely in a tree as well. Those were taken down and used for cattle. The discoveries felt like warnings, but their father ignored them. Years passed, and the basement became a source of dread. Anna shared the basement bedroom with her siblings, her bed facing the mirrored closet. So, I remember when I shared that basement room with my siblings. My bed was positioned in front of the closet doors at one stage. One morning, she woke to a figure, a man, crouched, his head jerking unnaturally. I had woken up but not moved yet, and there was a man crouched in front of me, just moving his head back and forth super fast. She blinked, and he was gone. I closed my eyes, and he disappeared. Footsteps echoed on the stairs at all hours, though no one was there. After that, we would constantly hear footsteps going up and down the stairs at all hours of the day. Anna once followed a man, thinking it was her father, but he vanished into the bedroom. I saw a man about the same stature as my dad go down the stairs. But the man I followed down the stairs had turned the corner to go into the back bedroom in the basement. And once I got to the corner, he just disappeared. Her brother, Sam, saw the same figure. My sibling had experienced this same thing too. The basement strangeness grew. Anna's younger sister, Lily, felt uneasy cleaning the back bedroom. My little sister was cleaning the living room in the basement one day and was getting an eerie vibe from the back bedroom. She closed the bedroom and bathroom doors, but the bedroom door reopened. So she went over and closed the bathroom door and the bedroom door. Once she walked back down the hall, she started cleaning up again when she noticed a few moments later the bedroom door had opened again. She fled upstairs. She immediately went right back upstairs. The room became Claire's, who saw the door handle turn and open on its own and that room eventually became my older sibling's room. She claimed that she watched the handle turn and the door slowly open, but nothing was there. One night, all four siblings heard a knock on the concrete wall, answered by another in a strange rhythm. A few nights went by, and all of my siblings and I were hanging out with her in her room when we heard a knock on the wall. So she knocked on the wall, and whatever it was knocked back. The basement's hold tightened. Anna tucked Lily into the lower bunk one night, kissing her goodnight. I went into the basement bedroom to tuck my little sister into bed for the night. I had tucked my little sister in on the lower bunk bed and gave her a kiss on the cheek goodnight. Climbing to the upper bunk, she found both Lily and Claire asleep. As I went up the ladder to give my older sister a kiss and tuck her in, that's when I saw both of them up on her bed sound asleep. The lower bunk was empty. As I went back down, I noticed the bottom bed was now empty. Anna ran. I immediately left the room. Their father built a wall to split the basement, but the disturbances continued, doors opening, stairs creaking. The doors we would hear constantly opening and closing when no one was down there. The stairs were stepped on where nobody was there. Claire saw Lily playing in the playroom, but it wasn't her. One of my older sisters had walked in there and saw my little sister playing with her toys, only to later realize that it wasn't my little sister in the room at all. The family avoided the basement. Strange sights plagued the property, figures walking fields, vanishing, or ghost cars fading into mist. We also used to see ghost cars or people walk down into the field and just disappear without a trace. A man with a dog appeared often, dissolving mid-step. We used to see a man walking his dog down in the field and just disappear all the time. Water damage forced a renovation, revealing a rough concrete patch in the bedroom, 5 by 2 feet, unlike the original floor. Eventually, most of the basement was renovated due to water damage. When my parents pulled up the carpet in the back bedroom, there was a clearly poorly done job of report concrete, about maybe 5 or 6 foot long and a couple of feet wide. After removing the carpet and 2 mirror doors, the disturbances faded. But once that basement was renovated, the weird activity basically just diminished. All they did was take the carpet out and 2 of the mirror doors on the closet. Anna searched for answers, but found nothing about the house. I've looked up this house address many times to see if anything had happened there, and to no avail. Her father dismissed their stories, forgetting the bones and clothes. My dad never believed my siblings and I about these experiences. And to this day, when we bring it up, he just sort of shrugs it off. He doesn't even remember the bones, the news, or the clothes that were thrown away all the time. Anna suspected something darker, rituals, perhaps, tied to the basement. I do believe that maybe someone was doing something sinister in the house, like maybe witchcraft or something was conjured up in the basement or something. The concrete patch haunted her, though likely just a bad repair. Also, the concrete difference is more than likely nothing at all, but a badly done repair job. The house's history remained void, but its presence lingered. Anna's dreams replayed the basement, the mirror showing faces that weren't hers. The family moved years later, but the memories clung like damp air. Lily refused to sleep alone for years, and Claire avoided mirrors, the bones, the nooses, The carvings, they pointed to something deliberate, something that had seeped into the house's foundation. Anna learned of local legends. A transient community once camped nearby. Their rituals whispered about, but never proven. The basement felt like a stage. Its mirrors, a gateway. Its concrete, a seal. The unseen guest hadn't left. It had quieted, waiting for the next family to claim. Story number 11. The living room was a stage of light and shadow, its large windows framing the backyard like a silent audience. 13-year-old Lily spun and leaped, her dance moves sharp and deliberate, practicing for a competition she couldn't afford to fail. Her mother sat on the couch, watching with a critical eye, but the air felt wrong, heavy with an unseen presence. Beyond the glass, the backyard stretched into darkness, the garden's flowers swaying as if stirred by an invisible hand. Lily's heart skipped, though she didn't know why. She dipped low, her reflection flickering in the window, and when she rose, something else was there. Not her shadow, not her mother's, but a figure, pale, motionless, staring from the other side of the glass. Lily's breath caught, her body frozen mid-step as the figure's gaze pinned her like a moth to a board. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and the only sound was the faint creak of the house settling, or was it something else? The figure didn't move, didn't blink, but its presence was a scream in the silence. Lily's skin prickled, her instincts screaming to run, to hide, but her feet were rooted to the floor. The backyard was empty. It had to be. No one could be out there, not in their quiet neighborhood. Yet the figure was real, its form sharp against the twilight, and it was watching her, only her. Her mother's voice broke the spell, sharp with worry, but Lily couldn't look away. The figure's face was a mask of horror, its eyes black voids that swallowed light, its mouth a slash of jagged teeth. Time stretched, seconds bleeding into eternity, until Lily's mother grabbed her arm, pulling her back to reality. The window was empty now, the backyard still, but the air was thick with dread, as if the figure had left something behind. Lily stumbled, her legs weak, her mind racing with what she'd seen. She tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in her throat, choked by fear. The figure wasn't human, couldn't be. It was something else, something old, something that knew her name. And in the silence that followed, she swore she heard a faint whisper, a voice like dry leaves, calling from the garden. When I was 13, I was practicing a dance for my mom. I had a competition coming up, and I was a younger member on the team. I didn't want to mess it up for anyone, so I made her watch me practice. The living room was their practice space, its hardwood floor scuffed from years of use. Anyway, I was in the living room which faced our backyard. We had a couple of windows that displayed the backyard in eyesight of where we were. The windows were wide, offering a clear view of the garden, where roses and lavender grew in neat rows. Lily had always loved the view, but now it felt like a threat. As she danced, her movements grew mechanical. Her focus split between the routine and the growing unease in her chest. And as I was doing this dance, I bent down, and when I popped back up, I saw a woman with dark hair in a white dress. The woman was a nightmare made real, her dress torn and stained, clinging to her gaunt frame. The dress was sleeveless, and her skin was so white or gray. Around her eyes was all black, as if she'd applied black eyeshadow all around them. You couldn't see her eyes, as they were also black and blended into the black ring around them. Her teeth looked sharp. All of her teeth looked sharp. Lily's heart pounded, her gaze locked with the woman's, and in those black eyes, she saw nothing. No life, no soul, only hunger. I froze. I stared at her for what felt like a minute until my mom said, "What is it? What are you looking at?" Her mother's voice was a lifeline, pulling Lily from the trance. She was panicked because obviously I'd just stopped all of a sudden and was just staring past her. And once she pulled my attention away from the woman, she was gone. Lily gasped, pointing at the window, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. I told my mom that I saw someone. She ran out into the backyard. Her mother, fearless or foolish, searched the garden but found nothing. No footprints, no broken plants, no sign anyone had been there. She came back in and said that there was nothing there. Lily's mother believed her, though saw the truth in her daughter's pale face and shaking hands. She believes that I saw something, though, because she says that I went pale and was just sort of staring at the window. The house had always been strange, nestled between two cemeteries, its walls steeped in whispers of the past. I'll add to that, my house was between two cemeteries. The block-out house was one street down both directions from the cemetery's particular. Lily's mother had once heard unexplained whistling, had called in a priest to cleanse the house, but the shadows never fully left. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. She kept her curtains drawn, but the window seemed to pulse, as if the woman was still there, waiting. The house felt alive, its creaks and groans no longer innocent. Lily's mother sat with her, recounting stories of their home's oddities, shadows in the hallway, objects moved, her sister's childhood fear of a man in the drain. When my mom and dad first moved into it, she swears that there were ghosts there as well. She would hear whistling often, but nobody else was home. But nothing had ever been as vivid as this, as real as the woman's sharp-toothed grin. Lily began noticing things. A faint smudge on the window, like a handprint, appeared each morning, though she scrubbed it away. Her dance practice moved to the bedroom, away from the backyard's gaze, but the fear followed. Every now and then, one of us would sort of catch a glimpse of a shadow or something, though her sister, now older, admitted to seeing a figure once, pale and fleeting, in the garden. Their father and brother dismissed it, but Lily and her mother knew better. My dad and brother don't believe in all that, but me, my mom, and my sister, we all swear that we've seen or heard things. She researched the cemeteries, digging through old records at the library. Stories emerged of a woman buried decades ago, a recluse who'd lived near their street, her life marked by tragedy. Some said she'd wandered the cemeteries at night, mourning a lost child, her white dress stained with earth. The stories were vague, but they matched too closely. Long black hair, pale skin, a presence that lingered. Lily began to wonder if the cleansing had failed, if the woman had been trapped in their house, waiting for someone to see her. Lily started sleeping with a flashlight, her door locked, but the nightmares came anyway. Black eyes, sharp teeth, a voice whispering her name. She avoided the windows, but sometimes, in the reflection, she saw a flicker of white, a shadow that wasn't hers. Her mother noticed, too, a chill in the living room, a feeling of being watched. Though she never saw the woman, Lily wanted to move, to escape. But the house was their home, and the woman, whatever she was, seemed bound to it. The years passed, but the memory of the woman never faded. I never saw the woman again, mind you, but I can picture her so clearly. Lily grew up, left for college, but the house between the cemeteries remained a scar. She avoided dancing near windows, avoided mirrors at night, afraid of what might look back. Her mother sold the house eventually, and the new owners reported nothing strange. But Lily knew the truth. It sent a chill down my spine, but I just couldn't look away from her. Lily shared her story only once with a friend who believed in spirits. The friend suggested the woman was a wraith, a lost soul tied to the cemeteries, drawn to Lily's energy. It didn't explain everything, but it was enough to give Lily a name for her fear. She still wondered, though, what the woman wanted, why she'd chosen her, why her eyes had been so empty, yet so alive. The house was gone, but the woman's face was etched in her mind, a ghost that followed her through life. Some nights, Lily woke with a start, certain she'd heard a tap at the window, a whisper from the dark. She'd check the glass, find nothing, but the chill remained. The woman was gone, but her gaze lingered, a reminder that some things never truly leave. Lily lived on, but she never danced in front of a window again, never trusted the silence of a quiet night. Story number 12. The state fair buzzed with life, a chaotic swirl of lights, laughter, and the scent of fried dough. Ethan, a 10th grader, trailed his classmates through the crowd, his mood as gray as the overcast sky. The agricultural show was a school trip, but their teacher had left them to wander, with instructions to meet later. Ethan wasn't into fairs. Cheap rides and rigged games held no appeal. He and 2 classmates, their names now a blur, drifted toward the rides, seeking distraction. Then a girl bumped into him in line, her smile bright, her eyes locking onto his. She apologized. They laughed. And suddenly, she was part of their group, as if she'd always been there. She was his age, pretty, with a warmth that made Ethan forget his boredom. Her touch was bold, her hand brushing his arm, lingering longer than it should. She didn't ask to join them, but tagged along naturally, and Ethan, smitten, didn't question it. Her name was Lila, she said, her voice soft but magnetic on a dark, haunted ride. She snuggled close, claiming she was scared, her grip tightening on his arm before sliding lower. Bold and shocking, Ethan's heart raced, torn between thrill and unease. The ride ended, but she clung to his arm, giddy, leading him through the fairgrounds like they were already something more. Lila spoke of Hawaii, of beach fires and guitar music, her words painting a life Ethan could almost touch. She was electric, her laughter pulling him deeper into her orbit. Then she suggested they go somewhere private, and Ethan, caught in her spell, agreed. The fair's noise faded as she led him past the bright lights, toward the shadowed edge where the Carney's campers stood. She guided him to a spot where 3 campers formed a triangle, pulling him close, her kisses fierce and urgent. Ethan, inexperienced and overwhelmed, barely noticed the world around him until a flashlight beam cut through the dark and a security guard's voice shattered the moment. The guard's shout was sharp. ordering them to leave. Lila bolted, vanishing into the night, leaving Ethan to stumble back to his friends. His pulse pounded, not from the kiss, but from a sudden, chilling realization. He didn't know her. He searched for her the rest of the day, scanning the crowds, but she was gone. The fairgrounds, once vibrant, felt hollow, the ride's music now a mocking echo. Ethan's friends teased him, thinking he'd scored a fleeting romance. But his mind churned with questions. Who was Lila? Why had she led him to that secluded spot? The camper's triangle haunted him, a trap he'd nearly entered. Back at school, he confided in a friend who laughed it off. Maybe she was just a carny's kid looking for fun. But Ethan wasn't so sure. The campers area wasn't just a resting place for fair workers. It was a world apart, hidden behind the glitter of the Midway. Ethan replayed Lila's words, her stories of Hawaii. They felt rehearsed, too perfect, like lines from a script. Her touch, so confident, had disarmed him. But now he saw the red flags, her sudden appearance, her rush to isolate him, the crusty camper she'd pointed to. He'd almost agreed to go inside, but the guard's arrival stopped him. What was inside? A lock? A box? A fate he couldn't imagine? Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. He'd read about fairs, places where people vanished, where smiles hid darker intents. Lila's beauty had blinded him, but her absence left a shadow. And at home, Ethan couldn't shake the encounter. He scoured X, searching for stories of fairground disappearances. Posts described girls who lured young men, only for them to vanish. Some claimed trafficking, others something worse, something older, tied to the transient world of carnivals. One user mentioned sirens, not mythical, but human, trained to charm and trap. Ethan's dreams turned dark, the camper's door creaking open to reveal nothing but eyes watching him. He wondered if Lila was a prostitute, a ploy, or something meant to lock him away. His parents noticed his silence, but he couldn't explain, not fully. The fair had been a thrill, but it left scars, a warning etched in his memory. The fair came to town the next year, but Ethan stayed away. His classmates went, sharing snaps of rides and games, but he deleted the app, unwilling to see the fairgrounds again. The triangle of campers lingered in his mind, a puzzle with no answer. He asked around, quietly, about missing kids from past fairs. A gas station clerk, an old man who'd worked the county for decades, nodded knowingly. "Those carnies," he said, "they come and go. Some take more than they bring." Ethan froze, the man's words too close to his fears. Lila's face, so vivid then, was fading, but her eyes, sharp, calculating, stayed clear. Ethan's life moved on, but the fairgrounds pull didn't. He avoided crowds, distrusting smells that came too easily. On X, he shared his story, hoping someone might know Lila, might explain her. The replies were varied. Some thought she just wanted a hookup, but others warned of darker fates, trafficking, cults, or worse. A few mentioned similar girls at fairs across the state, always charming, always gone by morning. Ethan saved the posts, building a file of clues. The camper, the triangle, the guard's timely arrival, they were pieces of a larger truth. He'd escaped, but others might not have. The fair wasn't just a place, it was a hunting ground. And Lila was its siren. Years later, Ethan passed a traveling carnival, its lights flashing in the dusk. He stopped, watching from his car, the old fear creeping back. A girl stood by a game booth, her smile too familiar, her eyes scanning the crowd. She wasn't Lila, but she could have been. Ethan drove away, his hands tight on the wheel. He still had nightmares, still felt the weight of what might have happened. The fairgrounds were behind him, but their song lingered, a melody of charm and danger. He dodged a bullet, but the echo of its shot followed him, a reminder that some invitations lead to places you can't leave. Story number 13. The bedroom was a sanctuary until the first drop fell, cold and uninvited, on Clara's face. She woke, heart racing, to a darkness that felt alive, watching her every move. The water came from nowhere, marking her and her friend, defying all reason. And that was only the beginning. Something unseen was stirring, leaving traces of its presence. By morning, Clara would learn that some mysteries demand to be felt, not explained. Clara, a high school junior, invited two friends over for a lazy evening of TV in her still cluttered bedroom. Two of her friends and she were laying in her bed watching TV and ended up falling asleep at some stage. Clara took the edge, with one friend in the middle and the other on the opposite side. The room was warm, the TV's glow casting soft shadows on the walls. Clara woke up to the feeling of water dripping on her face. She wiped it away, confused, and nudged her friends awake. She wiped it off and turned to her friends, both still sleeping, and woke them up and asked if they were trying to mess with her. They denied any prank, groggy and bewildered. The friend in the middle realized that she also was wet, but it was her shirt. Instead, it had about a palm-sized watermark. They searched for a source, a leak, a spilled drink, but found nothing. There was a glass sitting above them on the headboard, but it was empty and sitting upright, untouched. The ceiling was dry, the windows sealed. Clara's skin prickled as the room seemed to shift, the air growing heavy with an unspoken presence. The friends left. Despite Clara's pleas to stay, she begged them to stay the night because she was scared, but in the end, they had to leave, alone. Clara lay in bed, the darkness pressing against her. She could hear something rolling around on the floor underneath her bed. The sound was faint but persistent, like a marble tracing circles in the dust. She was confused by it because the day before she had vacuumed under her bed and knew nothing was down there. She froze, too scared to look, her mind racing with images of something crawling beneath her. Morning brought a chilling discovery. She woke up to find Tootsie Chew wrappers under her bed, which she didn't like and definitely didn't have in her room. Clara hated Tootsie Chews, and no one in her house ate them. The wrappers were crumpled, as if deliberately placed. Later that day, her phone buzzed with a TikTok from her sister, a video of a grotesque, demonic face set to haunting music. She messaged her sister and asked why she would send her this because it was so creepy looking, and she was already on edge, and her sister told her that she had no idea what she was talking about. Her sister swore she hadn't sent it, and when they checked, the video had disappeared from their message thread. Clara's stomach churned. The room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The strangeness didn't stop. A few days later, Clara stopped at a gas station for a drink and a snack. When she went to check out, the cashier asked her if she wanted to grab another Powerade or something. Confused, Clara asked if there was a deal. The cashier just flipped the screen and showed her the total was 6-6. The number sent a chill down her spine, and she quickly bought another drink to change the total, shaken. She visited a local native store, where an elder blessed her with sage and gave her more to burn at home. She ended up going to a native store that sells sage. The man who owned it blessed her with sage and prayed and sent her home with more to burn in her house. The ritual seemed to work. Nothing else happened after that. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in her room, dripping water, leaving wrappers, sending messages from nowhere. The house felt different now, its corners darker, its ceilings heavier. She wondered if it was a string of coincidences, or if something had chosen her, testing her with tints that defied explanation. The water, the wrappers, the video, the number, they lingered in her mind, a puzzle with no solution, a story she'd carry forever. Story number 4. In the dead of night, when the moon hung low over the sleepy suburb, something watched from beyond the glass. Clara, a girl no older than 4, lay in her bed. The purple curtains parted just enough to let the moonlight spill across her pillow. Her bed was right under a window, and she liked to sleep with the curtains partially open to look at the moon. But what stared back wasn't the stars or the night's soft glow. Every single night, she would dream she woke to see a humanoid creature outside her window. Its presence was a weight, a silent terror that pinned her to the sheets. And this was no ordinary dream. It came every night, as real as the walls around her. The creature was a nightmare made flesh, towering against the one-story house. Its frame filled the window, shoulders brushing the top, legs vanishing below the sill. It had grayish-yellow skin, wore no clothes, and pressed its hands into the glass, fingers splayed. But its head was wrong. Its neck reached above the window, looping back down so its face hung sideways, grinning. Those eyes, vast and gray-white, never blinked. 2 slits for a nose, and that smile, teeth once yellowed, stretching its cheeks into a grotesque mask. Clara would lie frozen, staring at it between her purple curtains, until panic tore her awake. The house was ordinary, a brick ranch in a quiet neighborhood, but Clara's room felt like a stage for something ancient. She was a troubled sleeper, her childhood a blur of night terrors and sleepless hours. She'd wander the house, a 6-year-old in a nightgown, startling her parents at 2 a.m. But this creature was different, not a fleeting horror, but a constant. She tried shutting her curtains, but in the dream they'd be open. And when she woke, they were too. The window was her only barrier, and it felt paper thin each night. The creature stood silent and still, its grin a promise of something unspeakable. Clara never spoke of it, not to her parents, not to anyone. Fear sealed her lips, and the dream's grip tightened with every sunset. For years, it came, relentless, until she was 8. The suburb around her buzzed with life, kids on bikes, dogs barking, but her room was a prison. She'd lie in bed, the silence deafening, feeling the creature's gaze before she even saw it. Other nightmares plagued her, but none were so vivid, so real. Its teeth, its eyes, its unnatural neck, they burned into her memory, sharper than any childhood joy. Then came the night at her grandmother's house, a turning point wrapped in mystery. Exhausted, Clara confessed the dream, her voice all against the creaking floorboards. Her grandmother listened, eyes sharp, and handed her a tiny clay figurine, its surface etched with strange symbols. "Sleep with it by your bedside," she said, "and it will never come again." Clara obeyed, clutching the figurine like a lifeline. That night, for the first time in years, the creature didn't appear. The dream was gone, and with it, the terror that had haunted her window. Clara's life moved forward, but the figurine never left her side. Now 23, she was an insomniac, her nights fractured by sleep paralysis and visions born of exhaustion. She'd experienced hallucinations, seen horrible things, but never that creature again. Her childhood home was long gone, but the memory of that window, those curtains, that grin was etched in her mind. She never opened her blinds at night, a habit born of fear she couldn't shake. The figurine sat by her bed, a silent guardian against a terror she couldn't explain. The world called her rational, skeptical of ghosts and ghouls. She considered sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide, anything before the supernatural. But this was different. The memory of those dreams was her clearest childhood recollection, vivid and unshakable. No other nightmare had been so consistent, so deliberate. She believed it was not a natural thing. Science could explain her other terrors, but not this, not the creature that came every night, not the curtains that opened on their own, not the figurine that banished it. Clara's skepticism was a shield, but it wavered in the dark. She'd heard stories of shadow beings, of entities that fed on fear, but dismissed them as folklore. Yet the figurine's power gnawed at her. Her grandmother, long past, had known something unspoken, tied to the clay's strange marks. Clara researched, scouring old texts for creatures matching her nightmare, but found nothing exact. The suburb had no history of hauntings, no legends to explain the thing at her window. Still, she wondered, had it been real, waiting beyond the glass? Or was it a child's mind breaking under sleepless nights? Now, living in a city apartment, Clara kept her windows covered, her life a careful dance around the dark. She was good at running on little sleep, her medications untouched due to the side effects. Friends teased her about her closed blinds, but she never explained. The figurine stayed by her bedside, a relic of a battle won, but never understood. She'd faced horrors in sleep paralysis, shadows, whispers, but none matched the creature's silent menace. Its grin, its stillness, its presence. They were her childhood's sharpest scar, a mystery she both feared and needed to solve. Story number Spain. The house was a monolith, its brick walls swallowing the sunlight. 10-year-old Caleb stepped inside, his sneakers echoing in the vast foyer, where an old chandelier flickered like a dying star. The air was wrong, too thick, too, as if the house held a grudge. He felt it then, a prickle at the back of his neck, like eyes boring into him from the shadows. Night fell, and the house came alive. A radio blared static from an empty room, its dial spinning wildly. Caleb's heart raced as he crept down the hall, the floorboards groaning underfoot. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with intent. He reached for the light switch, but it clicked uselessly. The shadows laughed, a sound that wasn't sound, curling into his mind. Caleb's dreams turned traitor night after night. He saw it, a figure black as oil, with eyes like burning coals, hovering over his bare bed. Its presence choked in the air, heavy with dread. He tried to scream, but his voice was stolen, his body locked in place. The thing didn't move, didn't speak, but it fed, drinking his fear like wine. The fear spread, a plague in his mind. Caleb's thoughts grew jagged, his memories fraying. He saw the figure in waking hours, a flicker in the corner of his eye, a shadow that didn't match the light. The house was no longer just a house. It was a trap, and the thing was its keeper, growing stronger with every shudder Caleb couldn't suppress. One night, Caleb woke, his chest tight, the room too small. The door creaked open, unbidden, revealing a hallway that stretched too far, its walls slick with something like blood. The figure stood at the end, its red eyes blazing, and whispered his name, not aloud, but inside his skull. Caleb's courage broke, and he knew this thing wasn't just haunting him. It was reshaping him. The house was a labyrinth of secrets, its long hallways and dark staircases hiding more than dust. Caleb moved into a large brick house that did have a kind of creepy vibe, with old chandeliers and long hallways. At first, the signs were small lights turning on and off randomly, radios turning on in the middle of the night. Caleb, a sensitive boy who loved plants and animals, dismissed them. He just sort of explained it all away, not thinking too much of it at first. But the house had plans. By the time Caleb was 12, he started having really bad nightmares no child should be having. The dreams were vivid, suffocating, filled with a presence that lingered even after he woke. He started waking up from nightmares around 3, with insane feelings of dread and terror, not just from the dream, but by a palpable feeling in the air. The fear wasn't just in his head, it was in the room, thick and alive. Each night, the ritual began. Caleb would hear of footsteps walking down the hallway and stop in front of his door. Then his door would kick open, and he couldn't see anything. He lay frozen, his heart pounding, sensing a presence just beyond his vision. Something was in the room with him, just watching. The terror was so intense it changed him. He developed a fear of sleeping and a stutter. Caleb began to doubt his own mind, wondering if he was breaking. He tried to seek help. Caleb got up the courage to tell his mom that he needed to see a psychologist, telling her something was upstairs at night. But his mother's reaction was strange. She looked at him in a weird way, raised her eyebrows, and never brought it up again. In their quiet, unemotional family, Caleb felt alone. He assumed he was alone in this experience. The silence from his mother only deepened his fear, making the house feel like a prison. The entity grew bolder. Caleb started having dreams about a dark figure with red eyes hovering over him when he slept. In those dreams, he fought to speak, to say a holy name he'd heard could banish evil. He would try to say the word Jesus, but the figure would choke him so he couldn't say a word. He woke gasping, the boundary between dream and reality dissolving. He even heard voices and could swear he saw a figure in the corner of his room. The fear wasn't just his anymore. It spread like a contagion. One night, Caleb sat up late, avoiding sleep, playing video games with his younger brother, Ethan. Ethan asked what Caleb was still dining up, and Caleb said he just couldn't sleep. Ethan said, because of the thing that lives up here. Caleb's blood ran cold. Their family was not a sharing, emotional one, so this piece of information changed everything. Ethan revealed that his friend had seen a black figure with red eyes and refused to sleep over. Caleb knew then that he wasn't crazy. The brothers huddled together, their whispers a rebellion against the dark. They swapped stories, each tale feeding the other's courage. But the entity sensed their defiance. The air grew heavy, the room colder. Caleb glanced at the window, and for a moment, the glass reflected not the night outside, but the figure's eyes, burning red, watching them. Ethan grabbed his arm, his voice trembling. "It's here, isn't it?" Caleb's teenage years became a battle. He learned it was an entity that fed on fear. The more afraid it could make him, the more powerful it seemed to become. The house was its domain. Every creak and shadow a tool to tighten its grip. Caleb saw it everywhere, in the flicker of the chandelier, the warp of the staircase, the way his own reflection seemed to smirk. His thoughts grew infected, his memories unreliable. Had he locked his door? Had he dreamed last night or lived it? The entity didn't just haunt, it reshaped. Caleb's fear spread to Ethan, then to friends who visited, their faces paling as they sensed the house's malice. One friend, after a sleepover, swore he'd seen the figure in a mirror, its hand reaching out. The house was a web, and the entity was the spider, spinning fear into power. Caleb's stutter worsened, his sleep a distant memory. He began to draw plants, animals, anything to anchor him to the world he'd loved before the house. But Caleb was no victim. He had to teach himself to not be afraid of it. A whole journey. He started small, forcing himself to walk the hallways at night, staring into the dark until his heart steadied. He read about courage, about spirits, about the power of the mind. He needed to believe he was more powerful than it. Each step was a victory. Each night, without a nightmare, a blow against the entity. He began to speak without stuttering, his voice reclaiming the silence. One night, Caleb stood in his room, the air heavy with the entity's presence. The figure appeared, its red eyes blazing, but Caleb didn't flinch. "You're nothing," he said, his voice steady. The room trembled, the shadows recoiling. The figure lunged, its hands clawing at his throat. But Caleb held his ground, his fear a fading ember. The entity screamed, a sound like glass shattering, and vanished. The house was still, truly still, for the first time. When Caleb left for college, the house was just a memory. Once he moved, he never experienced it again, but the lesson stayed. He'd faced a thing that fed on fear and won, not with weapons, but with will. The world felt different now, larger, but Caleb was unafraid. He knew fear could be a predator, but he'd learned to starve it. Story number 6. The old apartment creaked under the weight of winter, its thin walls barely holding back the chill. Lila and Jude sat on a sagging couch in the living room, the glow of their phones casting faint shadows on the Christmas decorations around them. The place belonged to their friend Fran, who'd left for a month-long job out of state. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something sour, unplaceable. Lila shifted, her eyes darting to the hallway where a string of motion sensor lights flickered on, then off, for no reason at all. Jude noticed it too. "That's the third time tonight," he muttered, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb the silence. The lights were meant for Fran's nephew, a sleepwalker who sometimes visited, but they tested them, tossing socks, books, anything down the hall. Nothing triggered them unless a person passed. Yet there they were, glowing again, a soft hum accompanying each pulse. Lila's skin prickled, a chill unrelated to the cold settling in her bones. The apartment was a maze of holiday cheer gone wrong. A lopsided tree stood in the corner, its ornaments glinting dully. Bells hung on doorknobs, silent but watchful. Above the hallway, a sprig of mistletoe dangled, taped to the frame. As Lila glanced at it, the mistletoe began to sway, not gently, but violently, as if slapped by an unseen hand. It tore free, sailing across the room to land near the coffee table. The air grew thick, oppressive, and Lila's heart pounded in her chest. Jude's phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his eyes were. Lila nodded, unable to speak. The room felt smaller now, the walls leaning in. They didn't touch the mistletoe, leaving it where it fell, as if acknowledging it might invite something worse. The motion sensor lights flickered again, their rhythm erratic, like a heartbeat out of sync. Somewhere in the apartment, a floorboard groaned. "Muh!" Lila forced a laugh, trying to break the tension, but it came out wrong, sharp, nervous. Jude didn't respond. He was staring at the hallway, where the darkness seemed to pulse, alive with intent. They were alone in the apartment, or so they thought. But the air told a different story, heavy with the weight of something watching, waiting, and it wasn't the first time Lila had felt it. Fran and her boyfriend had lived in this small, older, one-floor, two-bedroom apartment. Its walls so thin you could hear neighbors coughing through the plaster. The place wasn't much, peeling paint, warped floors, but it was home for Fran, her boyfriend, and sometimes her sister Denise, who drifted in and out. When Fran and her boyfriend got a job offer in another state, they asked Lila and Jude to house sit for a month. Neither had jobs, and they'd crashed at the apartment before, so they agreed without hesitation. Jude and Lila slept in Fran's bedroom, while Denise's room was mostly empty, save for her brief overnight stays. Denise's young son visited occasionally, a quiet kid prone to wandering at night, which was why motion sensor lights lined the hallway to the bathroom. But those lights had a mind of their own, glowing at odd hours when no one was there. Lila and Jude had tested them thoroughly, tossing objects to see if they'd trigger. They didn't. Yet the lights kept activating, their soft hum filling the silence like a warning. The apartment was a shrine to Christmas, every surface adorned with festive clutter. A tree leaned in the living room, its lights tangled. Paper snowflakes sat on the coffee table, curling at the edges. Bells hung on the doorknobs, and a plastic Santa sat in a dining chair, its painted eyes unnervingly lifelike. Lila tried to focus on her phone, but the decorations felt wrong, like props in a play no one had rehearsed. The slapping sound came first, a rhythmic wet noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Lila's eyes flicked to the mistletoe, swinging fast above the hallway, then slowing, only to be hurled across the room. They didn't talk about it, not really. Jude muttered something about drafts, but his voice lacked conviction. They left the mistletoe on the table, its presence a silent accusation. The next night, things got worse. Lila and Jude were sprawled on the couch when a paper snowflake slid off the coffee table, drifting toward the Christmas tree as if pulled. A heavy sound followed from the hallway, not a step, but something solid hitting the floor. They froze, waiting, but the apartment stayed silent. Bedtime brought no relief. The bedrooms faced each other across a blank wall where Fran had hung a cheap Christmas painting, a snowy village. Its colors faded. Lila found it on the floor, leaning against the wall, the nail still firmly in place. Jude stared at it, his jaw tight. "That's not right," he said. And Lila knew he wasn't talking about the nail. The painting went back up, but the unease lingered, a shadow that followed them to bed. Days later, Jude was alone, cooking ramen in the kitchen. The air was warm, the stove hissing softly. Then he felt it, a sharp swipe across his back, like fingers brushing his spine. He spun around, heart racing, and found the plastic Santa staring at him, its body twisted to face the stove. It hadn't been like that before. Jude abandoned his food, retreating to the bedroom, the apartment's festive glow now a mockery of cheer. Denise, when she was there, had her own stories. She'd felt pokes in the bathroom, quick jabs to her side that left no mark but plenty of fear. Jude admitted to the same, though he hadn't told Lila until now. Lila never felt the touches, but the mudroom, that cramped, shadowed space off the kitchen, filled her with dread. She couldn't explain the anxiety, a primal urge to avoid its dark corners. She'd stand at its threshold, staring, waiting for something to move. Nothing ever did, but the feeling never left. The strangest incident came near the end of their stay. Lila was in the living room, Jude in the kitchen, when they heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving from the hallway toward the main door. Lila called out, thinking it was Denise, but the steps stopped. She checked the living room, the door, even Denise's room. No one was there, and the door hadn't opened. Jude's face was pale when he joined her, his voice barely a whisper. "I heard it too. When Fran returned, they spilled everything. The lights, the mistletoe, the painting, the Santa, the footsteps." Fran's eyes darkened as she listened. She'd experienced things too, she admitted, once. She'd seen Denise's boyfriend walk from the hallway to the main entrance, only to vanish. She'd called out, but he was in Denise's room the whole time, asleep. The door hadn't opened, hadn't even creaked. They tried to make sense of it. Fran had been stressed, juggling her boyfriend's moods and Denise's unpredictability. Maybe the apartment had absorbed that tension, feeding something that lingered in its walls. It didn't feel evil, not exactly, just restless, like a guest who didn't know they'd overstayed. Lila and Jude never felt unsafe, but they never felt alone either. The decorations, the lights, the bells, they weren't just festive. They were markers, signs of something that watched, moved, waited. As they packed to leave, Lila took one last look at the mudroom. The dark spot was still there, a void that seemed to stare back. She didn't step inside. The motion sensor lights flickered as she passed, a final farewell from whatever shared the apartment. Fran stayed, but Lila and Jude never returned. Some places, they decided, were better left to their secrets. Story number 10. The air in the abandoned warehouse was thick, like breathing through a wet cloth. Ethan, a thrill-seeking 20-something, led his friends Mike and Bernie through a crumbling business site, its skeletal remains bathed in moonlight. The long, narrow structure loomed ahead, its ramp splitting the interior like a scar. They slipped through a rear doorway, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The place was mostly empty, littered with broken chairs and forgotten box. But something felt off, a weight in the air that made Ethan's skin prickle. On the right, near the ramp, a small closet stood open, its shelves lined with rusted paint cans and bottles of chemical thinners. The closet seemed to hum with a strange energy, drawing Ethan closer. He stepped inside, his flashlight flickering. The air grew heavy and oppressive, warm yet chilling. Raising the hairs on his arms, his legs locked, refusing to move, as if the room itself held him captive. Suddenly, he screamed. His voice not his own, a woman's cries echoed in his mind, her arms flailing in a vision of terror. "Stop! You're hurting me!" she wailed, her words searing into his skull. Ethan's chest heaved, his vision swimming, until Mike grabbed his arm and yanked him out, breaking the spell. He gasped, the world steadying, his heart still racing. The closet's grip released. Ethan felt normal again. Though shaken, he laughed it off, blaming the chemicals for his episode, but doubt gnawed at him. The three friends moved down the ramp toward the open exit, the far wall gone, exposing the night beyond. Ethan's flashlight swept the walls, revealing graffiti and decay. But the unease lingered. They were nearly out when Ethan and Mike froze, turning back. Bernie, a step ahead, halted, confused. "What's wrong?" he asked. Mike whispered, "Are you seeing this?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight, but Bernie saw nothing, scoffing at their fear. Down the ramp, a black figure glided toward them, a human shadow without feet, its edges sharp against the concrete. It moved with purpose, unnatural and slant, trailing a bright blue and white orb of light that danced just ahead. Ethan's blood ran cold. The figure wasn't just a shadow, it was alive, aware. The orb pulsed, its glow casting eerie patterns on the walls, ceiling, and floor, circling like a predator. Mike's face was pale, his eyes wide, but Bernie, oblivious, rolled his eyes. Ethan and Mike stood rooted, terror locking their limbs as the figure drew closer. Then a voice erupted, deep and thunderous, shaking the warehouse. "Get out!" The sound was a physical force, rattling Ethan's bones. He ran, faster than he thought possible, nearly tripping on debris. Mike was beside him, Bernie trailing, finally spooked by their panic. They burst into the open air, the night cool against their sweat-soaked skin. They stopped, looking back, but the ramp was empty. No figure, no light. The warehouse stood silent, its darkness swallowing their fear. Ethan's legs trembled, his mind replaying the woman's shrieks, the shadow's command. Outside, the three caught their breath, the stars above indifferent. Ethan tried to explain the closet, the vision, the figure, but Bernie dismissed it, insisting it was a prank or exhaustion. Mike, though, backed Ethan. His voice saw. He'd seen it too, felt its menace. They avoided the warehouse after that, but Ethan couldn't shake the experience. He researched the site later, digging through old records. The business park had been a factory decades ago, where a worker, a woman, had died in a violent accident. Her pleas ignored, some said her spirit lingered, tied to the chemicals that had burned her lungs. The shadow and orb were harder to explain. Local urban explorers whispered of a guardian entity, a dark force that protected the site's secrets. Its light a lure or a warning, Ethan never returned. But the memory haunted him, especially the woman's voice. So real, it felt like his own. He wondered if the shadow was her tormentor, or something older, bound to the land. The warehouse was demolished a year later, but Ethan still felt its pull, a reminder that some places hold memories too dark to fade. He shared the story sparingly, his voice catching each time, as if the shadow still watched from somewhere beyond the light. Story number 18, The Queen Anne Victorian stood like a relic of a forgotten age. Its gables sharp against the dusk sky, its window dark with secrets no living soul should know. In a small New England town, Edward and Lila Grayson bought the house, dreaming of a cozy B&B to crown their retirement. But the house had other plans. Its walls whispered of deaths unrecorded, of lives snuffed out in shadows that clung to the woodwork. The Graysons thought they were restoring a home. They were wrong. It was waking something else. The air inside was always too still, too heavy, as if the house held its breath, waiting for a mistake. Edward, a practical man, dismissed the creaks and groans as old timber settling. Lila, more sensitive to the unseen, felt eyes on her back, especially at the top of the grand staircase. They laughed it off at first, blaming fatigue, imagination, anything but the truth. But the house was patient, and it knew how to make believers of skeptics. Footsteps echoed where no one walked, soft at first, then deliberate, matching the rhythm of the Graysons' Lichtfield. Edward heard them one night, trailing him up the stairs, too close to be the dog, too real to be nothing. Lila felt them too, a presence that lingered at the landing, watching, waiting. They developed rituals, singing, humming, anything to break the silence that invited the unknown. But rituals fail when fear takes hold, and the house was growing bolder. The staircase was the heart of it, a spiral of polished oak that seemed to draw the darkness in. Edward avoided it after dark, but work and necessity didn't care for fear. One evening, alone, he climbed to his study, his mind too full to sing. The house noticed. As he descended, something followed, not a sound, not a shape, but a weight that pressed against his soul. The Queen Anne was no longer just a house. It was a hunter, and it had chosen Edward. The footsteps weren't his imagination, nor were the chills that refused to fade. Lila's songs couldn't save him now, and the new wing, built over a cursed well, offered no sanctuary. The house wanted him to know it, to feel it, to fear it. Every step he took was a step deeper into its grasp, and the Graysons' dream was becoming a nightmare they couldn't wake from. So, my wife and I purchased an 1890s Queen Anne Victorian several years ago, and we're slowly restoring it for a traditional B&B as a part of our retirement plan in like another 10 to 15 years. The house was a beauty, all intricate woodwork and stained glass, but its charm hid a history that seeped from the walls. There's every reason to believe that the original owners passed away in this house. The town records were vague, but whispers spoke of a family lost to fever, their spirits never leaving the rooms they loved. The deeper Edward dug, the darker the story grew. It's my understanding that somebody died in the house, and the body was dumped in a water well that is now covered in a mid-century addition to the original structure. Think Social Security fraud. The FBI ultimately dug up the body from the well, and that's when they found it there. The well, that's sealed under concrete, was a secret the house kept for decades, its waters tainted by a crime no one dared speak of. Edward and Lila tried to focus on paint swatches and plumbing, but the house had other priorities. Edward's first encounter was subtle, a trick of the mind, or so he thought. My first awareness was the sound of someone or something walking toward me, which I attributed to our large dog possibly following me upstairs, but she was downstairs and behind a closed door when I later checked. The sound came from the staircase, a soft shuffle that matched his steps, then stopped when he did. He laughed it off, but the chill in his bones wasn't so easily dismissed. Lila was less skeptical. My wife described similar experiences within the main area of focus. Being at the top of the stair landing, she has a practice of singing or humming a tune as she comes down the stairs, and she believes that this either interrupts the experience or at least distracts her from the experience. Her voice, light and clear, filled the house with life, a shield against the weight that gathered at the landing. Edward adopted the habit. I normally follow this musical practice too, whistling a tune that we sometimes sing to our dogs or singing an old jingle or whatever. It worked, mostly, but the house was cunning. It waited for weakness, for distraction, for silence. I was home alone this evening, and I needed to go upstairs to my study or lair to grab something. It was a long day, and I had a few pressing things on my mind. So instead of singing or whistling, I was thinking about a work conversation from earlier. Edward climbed the stairs, his thoughts on deadlines, not spirits. The house seized its chance. As he descended, the air thickened, the shadows deeper than they should be. As I was coming downstairs, I heard footsteps following me down, a different tempo and rhythm than my cadence. The sound was unmistakable, deliberate, a mockery of his own steps. Edward's heart raced, his instinct screaming to turn, to look, but fear held him fast. I slowed and thought about turning to look, but I quickly noped out, only briefly looking up. As I made the 180 turn at the bottom of the stairs and headed toward the kitchen, the landing was empty, but the presence wasn't. He felt it close, too close, a cold that wasn't temperature, but intent. I didn't see anything, but I could definitely feel like something was near me. I didn't feel like I was clear of the presence, too, until I passed into the new section of the house. The new wing, with its modern walls and sealed well, offered a fragile reprieve, but Edward's nerves sang with dread. The hair on the back of my neck and arms had still not settled down an hour later. The house wasn't done with him. Edward tried to shake it, busying himself with chores, but the feeling followed. I had to go back up to the front of the house briefly to check for mail, and now that feeling that I generally have only at the top of the stairs is just on the other side of that kitchen door. The kitchen, once a haven, now felt like a threshold. The presence waiting just beyond. Whatever it is, I think it's followed me down the stairs, and it's decided to stay there. The house had shifted, its rules rewritten. He couldn't speak of it. Not there. It just doesn't feel right or safe to speak about it inside this house, too. And so, I refuse to talk about it in the house. Texting my wife about it or sharing it here feels safe. Words spoken aloud felt like an invitation, a challenge to whatever lingered. Edward texted Lila, his fingers trembling, the screen's glow a small comfort. But if you and I had talked about this whole thing before tonight, then I would have said that I do believe that there is something there. But it's not anything bad. Now, I'm really not so sure. Doubt gnawed at him. Fear replacing certainty. The house didn't rest, night after night. The footsteps grew bolder, the presence heavier. Lila noticed too, her songs faltering, her eyes darting to corners where light didn't reach. They avoided the staircase when possible, but the house didn't need stairs to find them. Doors creaked in rooms they hadn't entered. Lights flickered with no cause. The well, though sealed, seemed to pulse beneath the floor, a heartbeat that synced with Edward's own. They hired historians, hoping for answers. The original owners, a family of 4, had died in the 1890s. Their deaths quiet but final. The well's victim was a later tenant, hidden by a greedy landlord until the FBI's shovels found the truth. Each fact made the house feel less theirs, more a vessel for things that didn't leave. Edward wondered if the B&B was a mistake, if they'd bought a tomb instead of a home. Lila tried to reclaim the space, filling it with music, with life, but the house resisted. The presence at the kitchen door grew, a shadow that didn't need form to terrify. Edward stopped sleeping, his dreams filled with footsteps, with hands reaching from the well. He began researching exorcisms, mediums, anything to break the house's hold. But the answers were as elusive as the thing that stalked them. Years later, the B&B dream remained just that, a dream. The Graysons lived in the new wing, avoiding the old house as much as they could. The staircase stood unused, its landing a no-man's land. Edward still texted Lila about it, never speaking aloud, never tempting the house to listen. He knew now that it wasn't benign, that it wasn't just a ghost, it was the house itself, alive with the weight of its dead, and it wanted the Graysons to stay forever. Story number 9. In a quiet row of houses in northern England, where the fog clung to the streets like a shroud, Thomas began to question his sanity. His new home, a modest mid-terrace, stood next to a house that seemed to breathe with secrets, its windows bare and its rooms stark. The family of 4 who lived there moved like ghosts, their faces lit by the glow of phones, never speaking, never smiling. One winter night, a knock at Thomas's door revealed the young mother, trembling, begging him to quiet a party that didn't exist. And then, without a trace, the family vanished, leaving behind an empty house that whispered with sounds and shadows no one could explain. Thomas had moved in not long ago, drawn to the charm of the old town. But the house next door unsettled him from the start. It was sparse of furniture or personality, with no curtains in the living room windows. From his car, parked on the narrow street, he could see into their dining room, where all 4 of them sat at their small dining table, transfixed on their phones, never engaging with one another. It wasn't his intention to pry, but the open layout made it impossible not to notice the stillness, the absence of life in a home that should have been warm with family. The night before Christmas changed everything. The mother, A younger lady of maybe mid-20s knocked on his door, visibly shaken. Her eyes darted as she spoke, asking him to keep the noise down. Assuming he was hosting a raucous gathering, Thomas was completely alone, instead on just watching a movie. He invited her to see for herself, and her face paled as she realized her mistake. She quickly made her way back next door, leaving Thomas standing in his doorway, the cold air biting at his skin. He brushed it off as a misunderstanding, but a seed of unease took root, growing with each passing day. Months later, the neighbors were gone. The house was empty, with no sign of them moving out. Thomas, often away for work, hadn't noticed their departure, but the silence of the house next door was louder than ever. He heard a persistent beeping coming from their old residence, a faint nagging sound like a fire alarm dying. Curiosity got the better of him one afternoon, and he stuck his head over the fence to take a look into the dining room window. In the barren room, a person stood near the doorway into the kitchen, making a quick movement towards him. Thomas stumbled back, heart pounding, mortified at his own nosiness, but terrified by what he'd seen. The figure hadn't been clear, just a blur of motion, too fast to be human, yet too deliberate to be nothing. Thomas spent the rest of the day in his garden trying to shake the image, but the house seemed to watch him. He heard no one leave that residence, yet the air felt charged, as if something lingered just out of sight. That night, as he worked in his study, he saw faces in the corner of the windows looking into his garden. Gaunt, pale faces that faded away once he noticed them. They weren't reflections or tricks of light. They were there, watching, vanishing the moment he met their gaze. Each sighting tightened the knot in his chest, a mix of fear and fascination. The house next door became a fixation, its empty rooms a canvas for Thomas's growing dread. He began to notice patterns, moments when the beeping stopped, replaced by faint scratches like nails on wood. He'd seen these faces 4 or 5 times now, and it had him pretty spooked. One night, unable to sleep, he heard someone running up and down the stairs for over 5 minutes, heavy steps followed by a grunt of anguish. Then absolute silence. The sound was so vivid, so real, that he grabbed his phone, ready to record. But the house fell quiet, mocking his vigilance. He sat outside the next day, camera in hand, determined to capture proof that he wasn't losing his mind. Thomas's life became a vigil, each creak of his own house a reminder of the one next door. He researched the town's history, uncovering tales of homes that held on to their occupants, of families who left but never truly departed. The locals spoke of the hollow ones, shadows that mimicked the living, drawn to places abandoned by warmth. Thomas was pretty sure he was sound of mind, but doubt gnawed at him. Was it all in his head, or was the house reaching out, pulling him into its story? He was currently sitting outside, primed to get photo or video evidence, his resolve hardened by fear. The empty house waited, its windows like eyes, daring him to look closer. Story number 20. The night was a void, swallowing every sound but the crunch of gravel under her tires. Sarah drove deeper into the countryside, her headlights cutting through the dark like a blade. She was chasing the northern lights, a fleeting dream she'd missed all year. As a scientist, she believed in ghosts, or at least their possibility, but never in demons. Yet, The abandoned military field she'd chosen felt wrong. Its silence too heavy, its shadows too deep. Something waited out there, and she was about to meet it. The field was a relic of secret experiments, its bunkers crumbling under decades of neglect. Sarah had visited once in daylight, noting the eerie stillness, the way the air seemed to hum with secrets. Now, alone at night, she felt the dark press against her. She pulled over, her phone pressed to her ear, her friend's voice a thin lifeline. The place was spooky, she'd said, with strange birds that looked like bats but didn't move like them. She stepped out, her breath clouding in the chill air. The field stretched endlessly, a sea of grass under a starless sky. She took photos, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. The northern lights flickered faintly, but they weren't what held her attention. The hair on her neck stood up, a primal warning she knew from her country childhood. Something was watching her, its gaze a weight she couldn't shake. She turned, and the world stopped. It was a shadow, moving like air, translucent yet solid, walking on four legs but upright. But it wasn't a dog, wasn't anything she could name. Its form shimmered, edges blurring, as if it didn't belong to this reality. Sarah screamed, bolting for her car, feeling it hit her back, bouncing off like it couldn't pass through. The touch was ice, a dread so deep it clawed at her soul, stripping away every shred of hope. She'd never felt such fear, like happiness would never exist again. She sped away, screaming for her dead father, her brother, even Jesus, though she wasn't Christian. The road blurred, her panic a living thing. She'd driven the wrong way, forcing her to turn back through the field. The thing was gone, but its presence lingered, a cold that seeped into her bones. Her phone call dropped, only reconnecting when she hit the highway. Her friend's voice broke through, but Sarah could only sob, the words trapped in her throat. Sarah didn't stop until she reached town, collapsing at a friend's house. The friend, a believer in things unseen, listened without judgment, offering a small charm for protection. Sarah showered, but her back felt cold, like a line had been cut down her spine. No marks, no proof. Yet the sensation persisted, a ghost of that touch. She lost her voice for days, blaming it on a cold to avoid questions. The fear stayed, a jolt of panic whenever something brushed her back. Weeks later, Sarah returned to the field, not at night but in the harsh light of day. She needed answers, needed to prove it was her mind playing tricks. The bunkers loomed, their concrete walls scarred by time. She found strange marks in the grass, long, uneven scratches, too precise for animals. As a scientist, she knew the mind could deceive, but this fear felt real, etched into her soul. She dug into the field's history, uncovering whispers of experiments gone wrong, things unleashed that weren't human. The locals had stories too. An old farmer spoke of shadows that moved against the wind, seen by soldiers decades ago. They weren't ghosts, he said, but something older, tied to the land itself. Sarah didn't believe in demons, but she couldn't explain what she'd seen. The field was a place of secrets, and she'd stumbled into one. She stopped chasing the northern lights after that. The sky no longer a wonder but a reminder of that night. Months passed, and the panic faded, though never fully. Sarah didn't talk about it, fearing she'd sound crazy or draw its attention. She threw herself into her work, grounding herself in data, in reason. But at night, when the world was quiet, she'd feel it, that cold line down her back, that dread in her core. The field had changed her, cracking her scientific certainty. She began reading about entities, things that fed on fear, that existed just beyond sight. One evening, she found a journal in the library, tucked away in a dusty archive. It was written by a military scientist from the 1950s, detailing experiments with energy fields, attempts to breach dimensions. The last entry was frantic. "It came through! It sees us! It's still here!" Sarah's hands shook as she read, the words echoing her own experience. The journal ended abruptly. Its author vanished. She closed it, her heart racing, knowing she'd never return to that field. Sarah still felt it sometimes, a shadow at the edge of her vision, a touch that wasn't there. She kept the charm from her friend, not because she believed, but because it was all she had. The fear was part of her now, a scar on her soul. The field was out there, waiting, its secrets buried, but not gone. She didn't know what she believed anymore, but she knew it was real, and that was enough to keep her awake, staring into the dark, listening for the sound of something moving. Story number 21. At the northernmost edge of Britain, where the sea claws at the cliffs of Thurso, Ilara thought she'd found paradise. The Scottish Highlands promised wild beauty, seals in the river, orcas in the waves, and skies that danced with northern lights. But the land had a pulse, a dark rhythm that beat beneath the beauty, and Ilara felt it the moment she arrived. Her walks along the shore revealed more than driftwood and shells. They uncovered omens, each one steeped in death. Dead seabirds littered the rocks. A half-eaten carcass grinned like a demon, and something worse waited in the dark, watching her from the sands. By the time Ilara realized Thurso wasn't the haven she'd dreamed of, the coast had already marked her with its curse. The wind howled secrets as Ilara and her dog, Macy, ventured east, the cliffs looming like silent judges. She'd come from Yorkshire, fleeing a gray life for the Highlands promise. But Thurso's chill seeped into her bones. The town felt like a purgatory, its beauty a mask for something older, hungrier. Each step along the shore brought new warnings, signs, shadows, and a woman with a dog too like her own. Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was speaking, urging her to run before it claimed her too. I live in a region called Caithness, in the small coastal town of Thurso, which is actually the northernmost town on the British mainland. Ilara had dreamed of the Highlands since childhood, a stark contrast to her dreary Yorkshire roots. I had always wanted to live in the Scottish Highlands, which seemed a far cry from my gloomy hometown in Yorkshire, England. When her father and his partner bought a weathered cottage in Thurso, she seized the chance. From what they told me, Caithness sounded like the perfect destination. Seals swam in the river, dolphins leaped in the bay, and the aurora painted the night. There were seals and otter in the town's river, dolphins and orcas in the sea, but Thurso's charm faded fast. But despite my initial excitement of finally getting to live in the Scottish Highlands, full of beautiful mountains, amazing wildlife, and vibrant culture, I would soon learn that the region that I had just moved to was far from the idyllic destination that I had dreamed of. Tourists swarmed in summer, but winter revealed a harsh, isolating truth. But when you actually choose to live here in a harsh and freezing coastal climate, This place feels more like a purgatory. Elara felt trapped, the town's beauty tainted by a sense of dread. I guess more than that. In fact, this place actually feels cursed. The first thing that I discovered here happened maybe a couple of months after I first moved to Keithness. Elara took to exploring the rugged coastline with Macy, her black and white border collie. In my spare time, I took to exploring the coastline around the Thurso area, east of town, past the river's mouth and the ruins of an ancient castle. A cliff trail snaked along the sea. On the right side of the mouth of the river, there's these old ruins of a castle, but past that leads to a cliff trail around the eastern coastline. One stormy day, they ventured down to the bedrock shore. I first started exploring this trail with my dog, Macy. On a very windy and rainy day, the wind screamed, the waves crashed, and then Elara saw them. Dozens of seabirds, lifeless, scattered like broken toys across the rocks. And making our way around the curve of a cliff base, we found something. Littered all over the bedrock floor were what seemed like dozens of dead seabirds. She assumed a storm had dashed them against the cliffs, but the sight felt like a warning. It was as though they had just fallen out of the sky and washed ashore. The next day, a woman with a young girl and a dog identical to Macy stopped her. It wasn't until a day or so after, though, when I went back to explore further down the coast, that a woman with her young daughter stopped me, shouting across the other side of the road through the heavy rain. She warned of bird flu, urging Elara to leash Macy. The woman told me that she had just come from that direction, but that there was a warning sign for dog walkers, warning them that the area was infested with dead seabirds that had apparently died from bird flu. The woman's dog mirrored Macy's, an eerie coincidence that chilled Elara. Although she was just a normal woman with her young daughter, they were walking with a dog that was completely identical to Macy. A small black and white border collie. It felt like a mirror, a scene that Elara was walking toward danger. But why this detail was so weird to me was that it almost felt like an omen of some kind. She found the yellow warning sign at the castle ruins, its contagion symbols stark against the rain. And on the entrance gate, I saw the sign that we had just been warned about. The sign was bright yellow and outlined with contagion symbols. Elara turned back. Macy safe, but the omen lingering. What I would stumble upon a year later, washed up on the town's beach, would definitely be far more sinister. Though Elara walked Thurso's beach daily, despite its stench of sulfur and swarms of flies. In the summer of the following year, like most days, I walked with Macy along the town's beach, which stretched from one end of the Thurso Bay to the other. The seaweed-covered shore repelled her, but the distant view of Orkney's islands drew her in. The one thing that I did love about this beach, though, was that on a clear enough day, you could see in the distance one of the islands of Orkney. One day, Macy darted into the seaweed, unearthing a grim discovery. She was rummaging through the stacks of seaweed when suddenly Macy had found something. A skeleton lay atop the seaweed, its upper half stripped to bone, its lower half grotesquely intact, hooves, dark fur, and flesh untouched by decay. What we found lying on top of a layer of seaweed was an animal skeleton. Elara guessed it was a sheep or a goat, perhaps fallen from an Orkney cliff. I wasn't sure what animal it belonged to exactly, but it was either a sheep or a goat. The upper body was indeed skeletal remains, completely picked white clean, but the lower body was still there. It still had its hooves and all its wet fur. The carcass's position, laid out like a human, arms and legs spread, sent a shiver through Elara. Although the carcass belonged to a goat or a sheep, the way the skeleton was positioned almost made it appear hominid. Its grinning skull and untouched flesh evoked dark imagery, like a ritual sacrifice. One of the first impressions that I had of it was that it seemed almost satanic. The sight felt like a curse, a marker of something evil woven into the land. However, what I also have to mention about this incident is that, like the dead seabirds and the warnings of the concerned woman, this skeleton almost felt like an omen, a bad one. Soon after, Elara's life unraveled, personal tragedies she couldn't share, but they felt tied to that grim find. Not long after finding this skeleton washed up on the town beach, my personal life suddenly takes a very dark and somewhat tragic downward spiral. Months later, Elara sought solace in a solitary hike, hoping to shake the shadows that clung to her. 6 or so months later, and into the Christmas season, I was still recovering from what personal things had happened to me, almost foreshadowed by the buffer skeleton. She set out along the cliff trail, her pack heavy with lunch and resolve. I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along the cliff trail east of Thurso. The trail led her to an abandoned port settlement, the Castletown Heritage Center, its stone houses and ruined tower ghostly in the dusk. And by the evening, I had walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. The settlement felt alive with menace, its empty windows staring like eyes. And at night, this settlement definitely felt more like a ghost town. A van appeared. Men burning something in a trash can, their gazes tracking Elara as she passed. A van had pulled up with 3 or 4 young men getting out. I wasn't sure what they were doing exactly, but they were burning things in a trash can. Turning back, Elara's flashlight caught a shape in the sand, a dark, squidgy mass that wasn't a rock. As I wandered through the darkness with only the dim brightness of the flashlight to guide me, I came across something. She hesitated, then touched it with her foot, wriggling at its softness. I lift up my foot and press it on the dark silhouette, but what I felt wasn't hard rock. It was squidgy. Her light revealed a dead seal pup, its flesh torn by a perfect bite, its skull missing, the skin flattened against the sand. But what the light reveals is something else. It was a seal, a dead seal pup. This seal pup had a chunk of flesh bitten out of it. But what was even worse than the idea that this pup was potentially killed by its own species was that this pup, this poor little thing, was missing its skull. Then another appeared, identical, same bite, same missing skull. I go towards it, and what I find is another dead seal pup. But once more, this one also had an identical wound, a fatal bite mark. And just like the other one, the skull was missing. The precision of the wounds, the absent skulls, defied explanation. Now, I could accept that they'd been killed by either a boat or, more likely from the evidence, an attack from another animal. But how did both of these seals with the exact same wounds in the same place also both have their skulls missing. Ilara's mind raced, the omens piling up, seabirds, the skeleton, now this. But what I do know is that both of these carcasses were identical. She fled. The cliffs and sea a blur. Thurso's curse heavy on her heart. For the past 2.5 years that I've been here, I almost do feel as though this region is cursed. Though Thurso wasn't just remote, it was a magnet for lost souls, retirees, drifters, and those running from pasts. Despite the natural beauty all around, this place does somewhat feel like a purgatory, a depressive place that attracts lost souls from all around the UK. The locals fled south, while outsiders like Ilara arrived, drawn by a false promise. Many of the locals leave this place, migrating far down south to places like Glasgow. On the contrary, it seems a fair number of people like me have come from afar to live here. The town's harsh climate and grim discoveries, dead birds, mutilated carcasses, felt like warnings from the land itself. Maybe this place isn't actually cursed. Maybe it really is just a remote area in the far north of Scotland that has, for UK standards, a very unforgiving climate. But Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that Thurso held her in its grip. Its beauty, a lure for those already broken. Regardless, I won't be here for much longer. She planned her escape, hoping the ghosts of the coast wouldn't follow. Story number 2. The forest outside Dublin was a maze of green, its paths twisting like veins through the earth. But to Liam, it was a sanctuary. Until today, the air felt wrong, heavy, with a stillness that swallowed sound, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. He'd walked these woods before, felt their strangeness, but nothing like this. As he ventured deeper, the light dimmed, the shadows sharpened, and a chill crawled up his spine. Something was here, and it was watching him. The new paths he found were narrow, untouched, winding through ancient oaks that seemed to lean closer with each step. Liam's boots crunched on fallen leaves, the only sound in a forest too quiet, too empty. He'd seen things here before, flickers in the corner of his eye, whispers on the wind, but they were rare, fleeting. Today, the forest felt alive, its gaze pressing against him, urging him to turn back. But Liam pressed on, drawn to the unknown, unaware of the terror waiting at the fork ahead. At the path's split, he paused, the right trail beckoning with its open, sunlit stretch. He took it, only to find it choked with thorns and nettles, a wall of nature barring his way. He turned, his heart quickening, sensing eyes in the undergrowth. Eventually, I got to a point where there was a fork in the path. I took the right side and eventually learned that that way was blocked by thorns and nettles a bit down the path. He retraced his steps, the forest silence now a roar in his ears. And then he saw him, a man, standing where the paths converged, his presence a violation of the solitude. The man was ordinary at first, short, his food stocky, his skin healthy, his stance casual. He had completely normal skin and a healthy body, important for the next part, and he had a sort of short and stocky build. His eyes locked on Liam, unblinking, and for a moment Liam froze, caught in that gaze. He was just staring at me, and I froze for a second, but then figured he probably got startled by me the same way that he startled me. He forced a nod, turning to the left path, his steps quickening, his mind racing to dismiss the encounter as nothing more than a shared surprise. But 2 steps down the left path, Liam stopped, a cold dread rooting him to the spot. He glanced back, and the world tilted. He was still standing there, except something was seriously off. He was now slumped over in an inhuman position, like his spine had moved up and snapped. His skin was pale and covered in bruises, and he was still just standing there. The man's form was wrong, his body contorted, his flesh a sickly map of wounds. Liam's breath caught, his heart hammering, as the figure stood motionless, its gaze a weight that pinned him in place. Liam didn't think. He ran at that. I quickly turned around, and I got the heck out of there, not looking back. The forest blurred around him, branches clawing at his arms, the path stretching endlessly. His lungs burned, his mind screaming that the thing was behind him, its twisted form gliding through the trees. I only stopped when I found another person, and at that point, I slowed down to walk again. A hiker's distant voice broke the spell, grounding him, but the fear lingered, sharp and unrelenting. I'm usually not afraid of the things in those woods, but I definitely was not about to risk messing with, well, whatever that was. He stumbled onto the main path, the normalcy of other walkers, a fragile shield. The forest's edge loomed, and Liam didn't look back, afraid of what he might see. The man, or whatever it was, hadn't followed, but its image burned in his mind, the healthy figure morphing into something broken, something not human. He'd walked these woods for years, brushed against their mysteries. But this was different. This was a warning, a glimpse of something ancient, tethered to the forest's heart. Back home, Liam couldn't shake the encounter. The woods had always held secrets, old tales of lost travelers, of shapes in the mist. But this felt personal, as if the figure had chosen him. He scoured local stories, searching for answers, but found only whispers of unexplained sightings, of figures that appeared and vanished. The forest was alive, its depths hiding truths no one dared name. Liam vowed to stay away, but the memory of that twisted figure lingered, a shadow that followed him, whispering that the woods were not done with him yet. Story number 23. The new house was too quiet, its halls too long, its shadows too deep for a 7-year-old's comfort. In the dead of night, something stirred, not with footsteps or whispers, but with the slow, deliberate slide of fabric. It wasn't a ghost, not a figure, but a force that moved the ordinary into the uncanny. A child's bed became a stage for something unseen, pulling at the edges of reality. And for young Caleb, that night would etch a memory that refused to fade. Caleb, only 7, remembered every detail of that night in their new home. The house had a split plan, making his parents' room feel far away. He woke in the night, unable to sleep, feeling scared for no clear reason. He got out of bed and headed for his sister's room. A soft noise from his bedroom made him turn back. The hall light was on, illuminating his entire bed. He watched as the top sheet slid upward toward the pillow, like someone was making the bed in slow motion. The movement was too smooth, too deliberate, as if guided by invisible hands. Then the sheets jerked down to the foot of the bed, then up over the pillow, down and up again, fast. Caleb's breath caught. The room felt alive, watching him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, and fear froze him in place. He wanted to call his sister, but couldn't speak her name. His voice was trapped, his body rooted as the sheets danced their unnatural rhythm. He saw the light turquoise sheets, the pillow's exact position, and felt the air on his arms, hairs standing up. Every detail was vivid. The bed was no longer his, it belonged to something else. Unable to shout her name, he managed a cry of terror. His sister ran into the hallway, saying he likely imagined it and to return to bed. Instead, he crept to his parents' room, sleeping on the floor beside their bed. He kept his room's light on for a long time after, each night. He stared at the sheets, waiting for them to move again. Caleb's sister, ever the practical older sibling, dismissed it as a child's fancy. But Caleb knew what he saw. The sheets hadn't just moved, they'd performed, taunting him with their impossible motion. He told his parents the next morning, but they chalked it up to a nightmare, their new home's creaks unsettling him. Caleb didn't argue, but he felt the truth in his bones. Years later, he returned to the house, now a teenager, and asked neighbors about its history. An old man across the street, who'd lived there for decades, nodded knowingly. "That house has a way of holding on to things," he said, eyes distant. He spoke of a previous tenant, a woman who'd claimed objects in her home moved on their own, books sliding, curtains twitching. "Never harmful, just restless," he added. Caleb dug deeper, visiting the local library. A dusty record mentioned the house's first owner, a tailor who died in the 1920s. Obsessed with his craft, legend said he'd sewn late into the night, his hands moving even after death, stitching unseen threads. Caleb shivered, picturing those sheets, pulled as if by a needle no one could see. Was it the tailor or something older tied to the land? He found no answers, only more stories of the house's quirks, lights flickering, doors sticking for no reason. Caleb still checks his bed before sleep, ensuring the sheets lie still, but some nights he feels the air shift, as if something waits to tug them once more. Story number 24. The city slept, but the night was restless. In a crumbling apartment building, a young woman lay in bed, the silence of her new solitude shattered by an insistent sound at her door. It came at 3 a.m., sharp and deliberate, cutting through the dark like a warning. She froze, heart racing, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. Who would come at this hour, and why her door? The sound returned, more urgent, as if testing her resolve. This was no mistake. This was a predator at her threshold. The old building creaked under the weight of its secrets. Its walls, stained with years of neglect, seemed to lean closer, listening each night. The visitor returned, his presence a shadow that grew bolder. The woman, barely 18, had just escaped a suffocating relationship, but now faced a new threat, one that refused to speak, yet demanded entry. What did he want, and how long had he been watching? Her apartment, once a haven, felt like a trap. The door, secured with 2 deadbolts and a chain, held firm, but the stranger's persistence gnawed at her nerves. She peered through the peephole, catching a glimpse of a blond man, his face unfamiliar, yet chillingly ordinary. He wasn't crazed, not woke, just wrong, like a figure stepped out of a nightmare. Each night he came closer to breaking through, and she wondered if Her silence was inviting him in. The city outside buzzed with life, but her world had narrowed to this door, this moment. She'd fought for her freedom, clawing her way out of a toxic past, only to find a new danger waiting. The stranger's silence was louder than any threat, a promise of something unspeakable. She couldn't ignore him forever. Something had to give. But what would it cost her to confront the shadow at her door? Time stretched thin, each night a battle of wills. The woman, Ellie, refused to cower, but fear gnawed at her edges. She was alone now, her ex gone, her life hers to rebuild. Yet this intruder had chosen her. The thought chilled her. Had he been watching, waiting for her to be vulnerable? She needed a plan, someone to stand with her against the dark. The midnight intruder would not win, not if she could fight back. In the late summer of 2000, Ellie had moved into a rundown apartment with her boyfriend, Mike. She was freshly 18. He was 22. But Mike was controlling, isolating her from friends and freedom. He refused to let her have friends or go out and enjoy life in the city. His jealousy manifested in bizarre, poetic rants, emailed as Word documents listing her flaws. One time, after she smoked pot, he compared her to Medea killing her children. Their relationship crumbled when a friend found him on a dating site. Her parents helped lug his stuff to his parents' house, and she kept the apartment. Alone at last, Ellie embraced her newfound freedom. She enjoyed her alone time and was free to have friends visit. The apartment, though old and roach-infested, felt like a fresh start. But on her second night alone, she was woken by a sound at her door, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. She checked the time, dismissed it, and tried to sleep. The sound returned, more rapidly, more aggressively. She ignored it, reasoning her friends wouldn't visit so late. Eventually, it stopped. Days passed, and Ellie reclaimed her life. She went out with friends, had drinks, came home alone, and went to sleep. But the disturbances persisted. At 4 a.m., the sound returned, this time with attempts to open the door. The building's flaws, peeling paint, no ace were offset by its sturdy locks. She had 2 deadbolts and a door chain, so she felt more curious than scared. Peering through the peephole, she saw a blond man, not a junkie or weirdo, but unrecognizable. It wasn't Mike. He was dark-haired and would have written a poem first, young and reckless. She returned to bed. The nightly visits became a ritual. Every night he would try to enter, but never spoke. Ellie, caught in a strange defiance, didn't call the police. It went on for a week. The stranger's silence was unnerving, his intent unclear but menacing. She began to suspect he'd been watching her, perhaps noticing Mike's absence. The thought tightened her chest, but she refused to let fear win. She needed an ally, someone to face this with her. Ellie called her friend Peter, a lanky, serious man with a gaunt face that seemed carved from shadow. Pete looked like the sniper in Saving Private Ryan. Skinny, bony, oddly serious. He arrived, his presence a quiet strength. They hung out for the day, plotted and constructed a plan. As night fell, they sat in the dim apartment, whispering, waiting. At 3 a.m., the sound came again. Ellie's pulse quickened. At the peephole, they saw the blond man. He stood there, a silent threat, his face pale under the hallway's flickering light. They moved as one. With the chain lock on, they undid the 2 deadbolts. The sound paused, as if the stranger sensed their defiance. They flicked open the doorknob, knives in hand, and screamed, brandishing IKEA kitchen knives. They shouted threats through the gap, their voices raw with adrenaline. They yelled, "We're going to kill you, come back here, and we're going to cut you." The blades glinted, more bravado than weapon. The blond man stumbled back and jogged down the hall. Peter and Ellie laughed, the tension breaking like a snapped wire. To Ellie's relief, the stranger never returned. All it took was matching his crazy, she supposed, but the questions lingered. She'd never know why he targeted her or why he was so insistent on getting into her apartment. She suspected he'd been stalking her, waiting for Mike's departure to strike. It was a crazy time, and she was glad it was over. Years later, the memory remained sharp, a reminder of her resilience. The midnight intruder had tested her, but Ellie had won. Her door, her life, held fast against the dark. Story number 25. The garden was a world of its own. A small patch of green where 7-year-old Lila could be a queen, a pirate, or a spy. She stood on the rabbit hutch, her small hands gripping the edge of the concrete wall that separated her family's backyard from the sprawling park beyond. All of the properties have a rear garden that was divided by a meter-tall wooden fence. Each garden has a shared rear wall that is 7 foot tall and made of concrete. The wall was her lookout tower, the park her kingdom to watch. But tonight, the air felt wrong, heavy with a stillness that made her skin prickle. It was not uncommon to find me playing off by myself in the back garden. Lila's brothers, too old to join her games, were inside, and her mother was busy in the kitchen. She was alone, and the world beyond the wall was watching her back. The sunset painted the sky in fading golds, but something else caught her eye. We had pet rabbits that lived in a hutch that was up against the back wall mentioned earlier. Lila balanced on the hutch, her sneakers scuffing the wood as she peered into the park. Being the curious child that I was, I used to like to sort of stand on the hutch and look over the wall into the park and people watch. The park was quiet, its paths empty, the swing swaying slightly as if pushed by an unseen hand. Then a chill ran through her, sharp and sudden, urging her to look behind. I had the sudden urge to look over my right shoulder. Something was there, in the neighbor's house, waiting. The neighbor's back door yawned open, a black void against the fading light. With the way my house is laid out, the kitchen is at the rear of the house. My neighbor's house, which would be on my right side as I looked back, is a bit different. Their sitting room is at the rear instead. Lila's eyes locked onto the darkness of the sitting room. There are no lights on, so it's dark in the sitting room, and I can't really make anything out. But I know that they have a sofa facing out, and it would be where I was looking. Then she saw them, 2 red dots, glowing like embers, floating in the black. That's when I see what looked like 2 red dots spaced apart and not changing distance from one another, floating in the middle of this black room. They weren't lights, weren't reflections. They were eyes, and they were watching her. Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat. I remember squinting, trying to figure out, what am I seeing? The dots moved, smooth and deliberate, arcing to the right and upward, as if a figure were rising from the sofa. as well. These two dots move in a smooth arc to the right and upwards, as if they were eyes on a face of someone standing up from the sofa. The silhouette was vague, a shadow within a shadow, but those eyes burned with an intensity that pinned her in place. As they move, they seem to get a bit closer to the door, and I can make really nothing out except for, well, a dark silhouette. Her heart pounded, a drumbeat of fear urging her to run. I freak out at that, and I run back inside all the way to the front of the house where our sitting room is located to tell my mom. Her mother's voice was calm, dismissive, a shield against the unknown. She assures me that it's nothing. Lila, trembling, tried to explain the eyes, the shadow, the way they moved, but her mother, distracted by dishes and exhaustion, sent her back outside. And so I head back outside. Lila's feet felt heavy, each step a battle against her fear. I climbed back onto the rabbit hutch and immediately looked behind me again. The doorway was no longer empty. The figure with its red eyes is now standing in the doorway of their house, looking out into the garden. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, its gaze a weight that crushed her courage. I nope once more back into the house, and this time I do not go back outside. Lila's world changed that night. For years, I forgot about this experience, but I have always been afraid of the dark. The garden, once her playground, became a place of dread. I especially hate looking out of windows at night, particularly into the back garden. She stopped playing alone, stopped climbing the hutch, stopped looking over the wall at night. She closed her curtains tight, afraid of what might be staring back. Her brothers teased her, calling her fears childish, but Lila knew what she'd seen. Those eyes weren't human, weren't animal. They were something else, something that knew her name. Years passed, but the memory lingered, buried deep until a chance conversation brought it roaring back. Something jogged my memory of it a few years ago, though, and every time I talk about it, honestly, it makes me sort of tear-eyed because it was terrifying. Lila, now grown, couldn't shake the image of those red eyes, the silhouette in the doorway. She began to notice things, faint taps on her bedroom window at night, a shadow moving just beyond the streetlights. I still remember every detail of that evening, and I wonder what it was that I saw. She drove past the old house sometimes, its garden unchanged, the wall still standing. My neighbors still live there, and I'm too scared to ask them if they've experienced anything, or if they have an explanation for, well, whatever it was that I saw. Lila started researching, digging into the history of the street. The old tram tracks, she learned, had been part of a line that carried workers to a factory long gone, its foundations buried beneath the park. Stories whispered of accidents, of workers lost in the dark, their bodies never recovered. The park itself had a reputation. People avoided it at night, claiming they felt watched, followed. One old article mentioned a groundskeeper who'd vanished, his lantern found glowing near the wall. As if left mid-step, Lila's stomach churned. Had she seen him or something else? Something tied to the land? The fear followed her into adulthood. At her new apartment, she'd wake to the sound of scratching, soft but deliberate. Outside her window, she installed thicker curtains, but the feeling of being watched never left. One night, she saw it again, a pair of red dots glowing in the reflection of her TV screen. Gone when she turned, she reached out to a local historian, a woman named Ellen, who knew the town's secret. Ellen listened, her face pale. "Some things don't stay buried," she said. "The park, the wall, they hold memories. And some memories have eyes." Ellen suggested a ritual, a way to appease whatever lingered. Lila hesitated, the child's fear still alive in her. But the scratches grew louder, the air in her apartment heavier, as if the thing had followed her from the garden. She returned to the house one evening, standing in the park near the wall. The air was still, but the wall seemed to hum, its concrete alive with secrets. She scattered salt, whispered words Ellen had taught her, and left an offering, a small toy from her childhood, buried at the base of the wall. The scratching stopped, but the eyes remained in her dreams, watching, waiting, a reminder that some things never truly leave.